Just wanted to quickly give a special thank you to all channel members and patrons that help make deep dives like this possible. If you want to help support this type of content directly, please consider checking the Patreon out, linked down below. Chief of Defense Staff during the war against the Locust, Colonel Victor Hoffman, or for simpler, more accurate terms, just Colonel Victor Hoffman. Dropping his position as Chief of Defense on account of titles as grand as that was a little bit misleading, due to no proper defense ever mustered up against the Locust. Regardless, his significance within the Gears of War universe cannot be overestimated. A hero during the Pendulum Wars, his innovative push to commission a Special Forces branch within the COG's military is what was directly responsible for the procurement of the Hammer of Dawn, permanently tipping the balance of the war against the UIR in the COG's favor, and thus directly leading to their victory. We've already covered that battle and Hoffman's place within it, only adding to his already impressive legacy. A legacy that goes as far back as the Siege of Anvil Gate. Now that's not to be confused with the Battle of Anvil Gate, as that takes place in the exact same location, and Hoffman does take part in that battle as well, but it's roughly 34 years later, and instead of it being against the UIR, it's against the Locust. Whereas the Siege of Anvil Gate would come to be the stuff of legends, catapulting a then young Lieutenant Victor Hoffman to the rank of captain. In the aftermath of the battle, he would receive the Sovereign's Medal, the coalition of ordered governments medal handed out to only the highest recognized war heroes based off their dedication to their post and somehow managing to survive against overwhelming odds. The only other medal that we are aware of to be as high of a regard is the Embry Star. Notable recipients of this coveted medal would be Marcus Phoenix, Dominic Santiago, and countless other gears that, more often than not, were actually rewarded that medal posthumously. Albeit, those were handed out to participants in major battles based off feats of extreme valor. Aside from Hoffman's personal achievements, the siege itself would forever have a deep effect on both him and the coalition. The COG would go on to build monuments to the gears fallen during the siege. In the Tomb of the Unknowns and the Plaza for the Tyrant Dead, the former was a massive graveyard where only the COG's greatest and most decorated gears were buried, while the latter was a giant plaza of onyx slabs bearing the names of gears who had died at the most famous battles in COG history. The dead of Asphalt Fields would be written besides the men who fell during the Siege of Anvil Gate. As for Hoffman, he was never one to shy away from battle. So it wasn't really the fighting and killing of enemy soldiers that stuck with him, but rather having to fake a surrender and kill a civilian who stole food, even though the person stealing food had the best interest, only trying to feed his family. The desperate circumstances surrounding the Siege of Anvil Gate would haunt Hoffman to the point that many years later he would liken this siege akin to the Locust Siege of Jacinto. Despite years being separated from it and having faced many hard-fought battles between those two major events, the desperation and barbaric nature would come to feel all the same. In the 62nd year of the Pendulum Wars, Lieutenant Victor Hoffman was commanding officer of Konat Platoon within the Royal 2-6 Tyrant Infantry, stationed at the Coalition's forward operating base known as Anvil Gate. It was adequately named after its location. Situated atop of a mountain pass and built into the natural cliffside of said mountain, thanks to its elevated position, it was surrounded by lowlands, providing an immense amount of strategic value. On the one hand, it allowed the COG's forces to see for miles any advancing army. Generations of grazing goats have eaten land barren of any real flora, save for an occasional thorn bush here or there, and a sea of endless desert, thus providing little to no opportunity of a surprise attack from an invading force. The location of Anvil Gate also described there only being one road that led to the gates of the fortress. It was steep, windy, and only wide enough for a single truck at a time, and flanked by dangerous drops on both sides. This road had a distinct advantage and disadvantage, just as Anvil Gate itself had. For the road, due to it being the only way here, it made security pretty much easy. However, that also made supplying equally as difficult. And then Anvil Gate itself was a part of a city of Anvigad. Anvigad was a relic of a long-gone era known as the Silver Era. Back during those ancient times within the history of Sera, the planet's two superpowers was Kashkur and Groznia. Both were massive empires. Groznia alone comprised of 400 million people, while Tyrus back then was still a very young nation. Its capital, Vafira, nothing more than a small village. Wars seemed simpler back then. Fought with swords and chariots, the prize of silver mines, within Kashgar was the goal here. Now many centuries later, instead of silver, the modern coveted prize was emulsion, where it just so happened 1/5 of the entire planet's reserves were here in Kashgar. So the job at hand seemed simple enough. The gears stationed at Anvil Gate were to, in essence, just keep an eye out for any UIR activity, primarily to the south of their position where the cognation of Kashgar shared a long border with the neutral nation of Vasgar. There has yet to be any fighting breaking out within the sector, but with the war continuously escalating every single day and Vasgar refusing to commit to joining the COG as a way to secure the value of Kashgar's emulsion, COG High Command grew increasingly anxious over a possible front to be opened up here. It was becoming absolutely vital that word of any UIR activity here be sent ASAP to COG High Command, so that way they can muster a large enough force to smash the growing threat in its infancy. The problem was, the gears here were slowly being lulled into a false sense of security. Let's use Hoffman as an example. By the time we see him at Anvil Gate, he had been stationed here for 3 months, counting every single day down for the remaining 4 months of his deployment to end so that way he can return home to his new wife, Margaret. In those 3 months, not a single UIR reconnaissance team, helicopter, or anything else that would raise any alarms have been spotted. And so many of the gears fell into this monotonous rhythm of daily life, far behind the front lines and slowly feeling like they were just forgotten. Hoffman himself began to refer to this place as the ass end of the world, surrounded by old yet impressive Silver-era architecture. He slowly felt himself thinking more than actually doing anything. He started to believe that he was actually marooned, jokingly saying that the higher-ups placed him there as a way to teach him some culture. He had just recently become an officer sent to a historic place where his commanding officer had just graduated from the academy, a man by the name of Renaud Sanders. Sanders was only a 23-year-old artillery captain who would often forget the basic stuff such as forwarding messages from the family of gears stationed here. So far from home, such things as letters from loved ones, a full plate of food, again, which had to be shipped in from a single road from the north, and a weekly delivery of movies that people had seen a year back in Jacinto were all precious things important for the men's morale. As Hoffman focused on that, he would equally focus on how Sanders had less experience in the field, but akin to his wife, was more cultured, as he spent his free time taking up the hobby of painting the scenery here at Anvigad. The place felt magical to him, and as he was painting, Hoffman would often think about his paintings perhaps being worth something one day. Maybe Margaret would enjoy such a gift. Or maybe that gift would push her over the edge, as he worried more and more about his wife leaving him. A deep sense of security that he had, as he was only 29 years old, still unsure how a trial lawyer, an educated, well-traveled woman, would ever have fallen for him, as rough as he was. She was typically in the company of people equally as educated as her, people who would have thought someone like Hoffman was only good enough to park their cars. When she came to her senses, something he believed was only a matter of time, the novelty of being with him would end, and she'd be long gone. Hell, he'd even point out that he never really left his bubble. The only reason they ever met was because she was working an inquiry for the Defense Department. And it was during that she somehow managed to stumble across him, and he was unshakingly honest with all of the answers he gave to her questions. Apparently that brutal honesty was a breath of fresh air that she'd later tell him was what she loved so much about him. It was all new to him. He hated being so far separated from sergeants and other men his rank. He hated being so far away from the front lines, giving him so much free time as he did, leaving him even feeling guilty, coasting here while his friends and men he trained with were dying on the far bloodier front lines to the west. So he would attempt to speak with the other gears as much as he could, sometimes more out of making himself feel better than his men. Now, Anvil Gate itself had a very small garrison, around 100 men and women. It also had a battery of Prince Ozor's artillery and 2 attached platoons from the 26 RTI and Ifira engineers. These gears were all spread out all over Anvil Gate, which was more of a vertical fort rather than a wide one due to its architecture integrating into the natural geography. The gears' quarters were spread across a number of buildings. Some were in regular barracks on the far side of the compound, and some were in the first cellar level, right where the huge gun placements of the fort were. And then there was a small footprint of tunnels and cellars deep into bedrock that was already honeycombed with natural caves and fissures. There was even an underground river that branched off from the surface about 10 clicks away. One day as Hoffman was heading to the small mess hall where the fort's main battery was, he would catch one gear in particular wasn't reading any messages from back home. This was his platoon sergeant named Samuel K. Byrne, or Sam for short. Hoffman began to take notice that to Sam, Anvil Gate was beginning to look more and more like home. especially because he had recently taken up with a local girl who was serving as a liaison of sorts between the Gears and civilian population. She was a good-looking woman, dark eyes, olive skin, typical Kashkar features. Hoffman let it slide. After thinking about it for quite some time, he came to the conclusion that there was nothing in regulation stopping a Gear from being with a civilian. As he was stuck on Sam not receiving any mail home, the radio on the other side of the room caught his attention. The broadcaster would go on to say, Vasgar's president, Lietenant, is facing a vote of no confidence after his administrative failed to agree to budget measures with the opposition Unity Party. Meanwhile, on Vasgar's southern border, there was a dispute with the UIR over gas supplies. Under these circumstances, President Lietenant has resigned, and the resignation of Vasgar's president created an alarmingly dangerous change of fortune. Almost instinctively, Hoffman changed his thinking. Instead of being in Anvil Gate defending Anvil Gate and the heart of Kashkar from its southern neighbor Vasgar, if deciding to change alliance or pick a side, could alter everything. It shared borders with Kashkar, Mgazi, and the independent Republic of Furlan. Altering its neutral state would dramatically change the course of the war for the COG in the east, and it wouldn't be for the better. This announcement was shared across both COG and UIR airwaves, including their allies. Nations as remote as Pesang, for instance, heard this broadcast. Pesang was a COG allied nation that shared a border with Vasgar and Kashkar. Although Vasgar was hundreds of kilometers away from Pesang, the only thing between the two of them were a vast mountain range. The Pesang were skilled mountain fighters with a deep warrior tradition centered around the arts of stealth, creeping up to an individual target under the cover of darkness and skillfully, albeit brutally, slicing their enemies' throats, or in some cases outright disemboweling them where they stood. Hoffman's later idea of special forces and stealth attacks would heavily be influenced by the Pesanga, who now would rally to the call of Vasgar's president resigning. Having suffering a brutal winter, this was the opportunity for many of the Pesanga to leave starvation and poverty. Eager to join the Gears, one Pesang in particular, a few centimeters too short for COG regulation, would still decide to take the chance to enlist. His name was Baitak, and he would later go on to be one of Hoffman's most trusted friends. Elam's resignation as president of Vasgar was almost immediately met with the chairman of the UIR, Daniel Vari, sending a detachment of UIR troops he deemed as peacekeepers to, as he put it, provide support and protection of the Vasgari people to enable them to resolve their constitutional crisis without foreign interference, publicly stating it's in the best interest of the entire region to have a stable and secure Vasgar. Of course, this was all a giant lie the COG seen through. Vasgar's government crumbling did nothing but provide an opportunity for the UIR to send troops into the region to further their own interest. 200 troops from the independent Republic of Furlan, serving as these quote-unquote peacekeepers, were sent to occupy the entire nation and set it as a staging ground for a potential invasion of Kashkar. The COG would go on to move their own forces accordingly out in the western area of Kashkar. Here, the rest of the 2-6 Royal Tyrant Infantry, nicknamed the Unvanquished on account of their impressive military achievements in the face of overwhelming odds, were moved to a forward operating base named Tyro. Howard Company, consisting of renowned veterans such as Adam Phoenix and Helena Stroud, father of Marcus Phoenix and mother of Anya Stroud respectively, were already preparing to be sent here. The change of Vasgar's political climate while en route here just happened to be coincidental timing. Speaking of Tyro, it was nothing more than a collection of temporary huts clinging to the slopes of the mountains that separated Kashkar from its neighbors on 3 sides. And during this time of year, the region suffered from a seemingly endless gust of aggressive winds. It was here discussions on what to do next ran rampant, with the Gears at Tyro arriving only an hour after Daniel Vari announced sending troops into Vasgar under the lie of protecting Vasgar's neutrality. Considering their forward position, the idea of sending Gears into Vasgar to combat UIR troop presence from Tyro was brought up. Ultimately, it was shut down due to the COG choosing to respect Vasgar's final decision on being neutral. Gears crossing into the border would do nothing but undermine respecting that neutrality. And now, after so-called peacekeepers being sent by their enemies, Gears moving in would be seen as opening up a new front, exactly what the COG didn't want. Besides, the higher-ups were arguing Vasgar's collapse was sounding to be an extremely aggressive affair. Any force, COG or UIR, would be walking into what was believed to be a hostile territory. So the move was just to set up aggressive defensive positions so when the inevitable UIR troops attempted to come to Kashkar, the coalition would be ready. Adam Phoenix would begin by overviewing some aerial recon images taken from the border of Furlan. These images were roughly 4 hours old at this point. He guessed it'll be by tomorrow that UIR artillery and cavalry would reach the first crossing point. With the enemy moving and a real possibility of a new front opening up here, and Tyro being the first line of defense, their objective was ultimately split in two. The main objective was to make sure no UIR forces made it to Shivad. This was a large city in southwestern Kashgar, and thus a major priority, while Adam Phoenix was to take a small number of gears with them to shut down the main emulsion pipeline and reroute all supplies back to the north as soon as UIR troops from Furlan crossed the border into Vasgar. The point was to cut Vasgar off of its supply of emulsion coming from Kashgar, making it harder for UIR forces to keep themselves supplied. And waiting at the exact moment where UIR troops crossed the border gave the coalition a proper excuse. They weren't switching sides on the neutral Vasgar, but rather defending their interests from an enemy that was sneaking in through the back door. An excuse that was going to be very important because cutting off Vasgar meant that there was a major collateral effect. Millions of Vasgar civilians would ultimately be thrown into a desperate fuel embargo right as summer was intensifying, and a dangerously cold winter was going to be around the corner. The coalition's high command secretly hoped this would make the civilians that much more hostile towards their UIR occupiers, recognizing them as the reason emulsion was being cut off and their pointless suffering all the more unbearable. Identifying having to shut down the pipelines at Eschian Ridge, Borlane, and then open up the emergency pipeline at Gatka to reroute all the fuel back up north, Adam Phoenix identified he'll need 3 teams of engineers for his contingency plan, which was ultimately to blow an entire section of the pipeline, permanently shutting off emulsion supplies to Vasgar if he couldn't properly shut them down in time. He also needed 3 infantry platoons to help guard the pipeline while the engineers worked to shut off the emulsion. In the event of the UIR deploying special forces to stop them, he wanted to have his men well protected. Then once the emulsion was dealt with, he was to check in with his commander, Colonel Choi, and see if Shivad needed reinforcements, in which case he was to do so and reunite with the rest of the battalion. Clean-cut orders all round as far as Adam was concerned, though putting the plans into action would end up being a more delicate situation because the 3 hubs he was ordered to go to was all under the control of civilians working for the emulsion companies, who had no idea their military had plans to cut off a nation's entire supply of fuel. The reason for not sharing that was, well, they didn't want any emulsion company talking to each other. They had no allegiance to the COG or UIR, and the leak of the COG's intentions to the UIR was actually a real possibility. So they would be strolling in, unannounced, and immediately telling these civilians that the military is going to be commandeering these supply hubs. Then the engineers got involved with the plan, sharing how complicated things really were. They'd revealed to Adam that it takes days to safely shut down an emulsion pipeline. The pipeline itself heads to 2 very distinct Vasgari refineries, and the nation completely runs off of emulsion now. By their estimates, the entire nation would run through its whole reserves in a matter of days. Electricity would go first, then traffic lights, vehicles, factories nationwide would grind to a halt, and lastly, hospital power and water pumping supplies. In other words, civilians aren't just facing harsh weather here with no power, they're facing a countdown of harsh weather while deprived of everything they need to live. Plus, Vasgar technically is a neutral ally, but apart from that, there will be a little bit of friendly fire. Anvil Gate is COG, and the engineers revealed to him that that fortress actually gets its power from the side of Vasgar. Without thinking too deeply about it, Adam's response was simple enough. If that's the case, they'll have to manually resupply the fortress from a nearby Kashgar depot, and send the tanker down the lonely road to their gears up there, and they should be all set. He had the confidence of Anvil Gate's history behind his planning. All foreign invaders had met their end at Anvil Gate. Unable to break through the pass, it'd be the same here. Either the UIR gets pushed back at Anvil Gate, or they run out of fuel before they can ever reach it. His only problem really was making sure that he informed the garrison commander his power will be shut off. But just hang tight, rain down heavy ordnance on any UIR forces they see, and everything will be all set. The rest of the COG is not forgetting about them. However, he'll reach out to him in time. Right now, the primary thing was to head out to Borlane, 2 hours from their current position. Meanwhile, the following day, Anvil Gate, made aware of the COG's plans, was preparing itself for what was to come. They were well informed of Asgar's collapse, at least as much as it could be, and UIR soldiers heading into the nation from the south. There were mutterings of them being stuck at Anvil Gate for the long haul. So instinctively, Captain Sander, green and cautious to a fault, began to rush in supplies and extra munitions into the fortress in case of the campaign being dragged on. It was only 5:30 in the morning, and the entire fort was shimmering in the darkness, illuminated by the dozens of lights used by gears to move around their supplies. The most significant of which was 150mm shells for the heavy guns, moved around in alleys and narrow passages to makeshift shell stores. So much ammunition and supplies was brought in that it was beginning to look as if Sanders was preparing for a siege, while other gears were hopeful the UIR would come to their senses and not come after Kashgar. Vasgar was important enough in terms of iron deposits and stronger industry to the south of that country. Those could be raided and used to help the UIR on a grander scale rather than come north and attempt to take on Anvil Gate. There was no need to attack Kashgar and further spread out COG forces on the front lines either. At least that's what these gears were telling themselves. As of right now, they were 500 clicks from the advancing UIR forces, and their stomachs were nodding. Hoffman, a veteran at the time, was experiencing the same pump of adrenaline, unsure of how to really feel. Missing the thrill of battle, but getting it at the cost of Vasgari civilians suffering really muddied the waters for him, which only got worse when Sander updated him on the situation with Phoenix. According to reports, the UIR forces faced minor resistance from Vasgar, but their armor rolled in, smashing it entirely. Phoenix, on the other hand, managed to shut down the pipeline after the companies gave him grief about cutting off the whole country of its power. Their reason? Well, it wasn't the morality of the situation. It was all about who was going to compensate them. No matter. As of now, COG forces are at Retcon 3. In other words, they've all been greenlit to attack Vasgari positions when they make contact. Vasgar is technically in a state of civil war, and as far as the COG is concerned, is actively being invaded by the UIR. There's no confirmation on how much resistance the UIR will face from them, but there's also no certainty on if Vasgar decides to hand over its military for the UIR to utilize against the COG. And that's not even considering the massive civilian elements, resentful of possibly seeing the COG as abandoning them as some gears felt that they were. Anvil Gates was officially ready for war. Now, apart from the 100 gears within the fort, there was about 1,000 civilians living just outside the walls of the city, and an additional 3,000 inside the fort. So a total of 4,000 civilians these gears had to look out for. It was as large of a population that this rocky place could support, and each civilian had been drilled on what to do in the event of an attack or war reaching them. Funny enough, unlike the gears, the civilians were much less anxious. They've been accustomed to sitting tight and waiting for the invading force to exhaust itself on the stubborn rock formation, and then just leave. They were so relaxed, in fact, that as Hoffman was taking a drive to check in on the mood of the civilians, a cafe owner joked at him, saying that he would finally be able to use that rifle of his. When answered by Hoffman what the Indies may bring some big guns to use this time, the cafe owner would just laugh, saying taking Anvil Gate was about the same as walking up to a man with a loaded rifle trained on you, and somehow you managing to disarm him. Their garrison can watch the enemy approaching before they can ever come within range of a battery. There were seemingly no surprises the Indies can throw at Anvil Gate. Well, little did they know, the city of Shivad was being evacuated. The coalition were sending in tanks, and there was news that the UIR's forces, specifically Furlan's 3rd Infantry, had reached the city of Oskany. Oskany was about 50 miles inside of Kashgar from the border with Furlan. It was reported that there was no resistance apart from a roadblock erected by a police chief, and that was, as expected, smashed through. Maybe Anvil Gates was a potential feigned attack, and the real drive was Kashgar, Hoffman thought. It killed him to think all of this was going on and he couldn't do anything besides just sit and wait. In the distance out facing Vasgar, he can see the lights slowly disappearing as emulsion dried up right before his eyes, as this nation began to be deprived from what was considered to be a friendly, neutral country. And he just sat there thinking about that as an enemy army approached him as he waited for them. Unbearable to sit and just continue to think. He would take one final walk around the fort, and everywhere he went, he was truly amazed at this fort's vantage points. Every artilleryman was manning his gun. Each person had a radio all tuned into Ephira World News. It was a strange sight. Sitting at the gun on one of these artillery pieces felt like, as a gear put it, sitting in a chopper gunner staring at a stationary target, literally shooting fish in a barrel. The serenity of the moments and the absolute insanity of any force coming directly from such a disadvantage was shattered by a faint whump. Instinctively, Hoffman's ears perked up, but he couldn't pinpoint what direction it came from. But that sound to him was unmistakable. It was a large gun firing. or an explosion of some sort, either an artillery piece, large turrets on a tank, or perhaps some detonated charges. And then another muffled whoomp, followed by a slow rumbling noise that built into a large deafening roar. While searching for this noise, Hoffman would run into Sander, yelling at what the hell that noise was. There's absolutely nothing in front of them for 200 degrees, so the idea of an enemy attack didn't seem like a real possibility. But then the radio crackled. Sam was trying to inform Hoffman and Sander there's possible enemy contact to the north of the fort in the gorge. The pair would race to face the other direction, Hoffman pounding down the stairs to the next level of the fort where he could look out its back towards the road to Kashgar. Upon first sight, he's seen a pall of smoke rising from the gorge and spreading out. With Sander behind him, they first questioned perhaps it was vapor in the pipeline that somehow been ignited. Emulsion itself was highly flammable, shutting down the pipeline could have led to that. Pipes leaked, and when pressure dropped and thick fluid ran away from cracked metal and perished steel, accidents could follow quickly behind. Accidents similar to what they're looking at. The road to Kashgar itself was also now difficult to see in this thick cloud. Hoffman could see the further part of it leading north, however it just disappeared under this ball of smoke, and that's when he realized part of the road was gone. He dismissed it as a landslide, an accident that was just a freak of nature. But Sander, almost pale, said that he counted 3 explosions. That road was under 1,000 tons of rubble. It had to have been someone and not a natural disaster that created this. Not wanting to be stuck inside the fortress, Samuel Byrne was reporting in again, sharing with both Hoffman and Sander that he was going to be taking an ATV so he can go out and check. In response, Hoffman ordered Patrick Sultan, a South Islander who was a gifted sniper and stationed here at Anvil Gates as well, to get his team into position and provide cover for Byrne. Meanwhile, as Hoffman made his way to the main gates of the city, it was packed with civilians all trying to understand what the hell just happened. It was so chaotic that he had to yell at the crowd and force himself through, eventually being called by an engineer sitting in a small ATV to come over and sit with him. As Hoffman entered the cab of the vehicle, he attempted to inform the gear that the explosion that they all just heard was most likely the pipeline that had ruptured. The gear, however, was convinced otherwise. As it turns out, he wasn't just another gear, but an experienced engineer. He'd tell Hoffman that he counted 3 explosions, detonations. Those weren't occurrences of rock just naturally shifting. They were timed and in regular intervals, the very thing he has had many years working with. Facing the possibility of someone intentionally sabotaging their only supply routes, the pair would drive out of the city to go and confirm who was right, and, well, it wasn't Hoffman. The path leading to Anvil Gates was a narrow gorge between 2 big rocky cliffs that were getting on for mountain size. That morning, the gorge had been a deep cut, which was the V shape. The bottom of said V was exactly where Anvil Gates was, and the 2 sides were the large mountains. Now there was a wall of rock at least 25 meters high, with the road vanished beneath it. Carlisle, the engineer that Hoffman was speaking to, casually mentioned the Indies must have blew up the hillside in order to cut off this road. Hoffman questioned why he would think it was enemy activity that did this, or even if that's what happened. Carlisle confirmed his suspicion by simply pointing Hoffman's attention to the hill to their left. The top of said hill appears to have been sheared off. The issue for Carlisle, though, was this. If he was going to do a spot of counter mobility, just as this appeared to be to him, and they were going to pack explosives into a hillside to bring the entire thing down, this is exactly what it would look like afterward. Victor began to chew over the possibility of this really being the act of Indies, and if so, they've effectively cut Anvil Gate off from the rest of Kashgar. They managed to somehow take advantage of the fort facing the wrong direction, expecting them to come from Vasgar all along, when in reality, they managed to come from behind them. Standing on top of the mound of rocks they believe the Indies brought down on them, Hoffman was looking up at a brand new Raven. It took about an hour for COG HQ in the city of Lakar to get a chopper over to them. The purpose being that he wanted to use this as reconnaissance to identify any UIR troop movements between them and the rest of Kashgar. In the meantime, Gears set up machine gun placements to make sure close quarters, regardless of what direction the enemy came from, was no problem. Boxed in or not, this was not the time to remain complacent. After a few minutes of thorough surveillance, the Raven crew came back with no enemy activity. As far as they believe, there's nothing but goats and a vast emptiness between here and the rest of Kashgar behind them. Besides, with fighting intensifying in Shivad, the Raven was badly needed there. So the pilot would ask if there was any casualties or any immediate concerns, because if not, they were going to take off and head for Shivad, as every attack aircraft was desperately needed there. Which the pilot also shared that apart from being boxed in by the blown rubble, which did of course place them in a very difficult position. If Sivad fell, Anvil Gates would then be left alone. So it was in the best interest of everybody for Sivad to be held. In response to this, Hoffman would wave the chopper off. As of now, everything wasn't dire, at least not yet. On Brigade, both city and garrison may be cut off for now, but they have 2 weeks of supplies at any time. Both civilians and military personnel were used to being stranded, either by the weather or just not getting supplies when they were expected, so nothing here was really new. What bothered Hoffman really was whoever deciding to blow this mountaintop and then just leaving, not seeing any UIR troops. So he would turn to Carlisle to answer more questions about the job, who gladly informed Hoffman this job was indeed one that would have taken some time. It's thousands of kilos of explosives that needed to be used to bring down this amount of rock on the road. To ship that in without being spotted meant having to do it on foot over the hills, a single load at a time. Then they would have to bore holes and then finally set the charges. It would be a long job. Carlisle, which ultimately shared that it took a lot of time, it was deliberately done. The main question for him is identifying who was responsible for this. Was it the work of UIR spec ops or civilian sympathizers? Civilians in the mining industry have this level of skill with explosives, so it's hard to tell. It could have been anybody. It could have been secret agents of the UIR taking advantage of the UIR invading. It could have been part of Vasgar civilians angrily responding to being cut off from their fuel. There's also the possibility of, if this was done by UIR troops or anybody else in support of the UIR, they could be well back over the UIR borders. Who knows what they are ultimately, or who they are. Inside the forts, growing concern over the situation was beginning to overtake the civilians who clamored for news. Sander would do his best to promise them everything was under control, and he was actually proving to be a great liaison between gears and civilians. Now, with the road blown, Hoffman also seen his move of hoarding supplies as a smart and clairvoyant one, making him ashamed of thinking Sander had no interest in anything apart from painting all day. Given the dangerous and frankly unknown circumstances, Hoffman would be informed that Sander had requested the Anvil Gate City Council to activate civil emergency procedures. Doing so would increase the security around here, limiting civilian movement, full checks on civilians going in and out of Anvil Gates, that's if they somehow managed to get permission to go outside, and harsher management of resources overall. Rationing was going to be put into effect. As a way to compromise with the civilians and keep them free of any form of panic, against Hoffman's own desires, Sander agreed to increase the number of patrols around and outside to help save face. As far as he was concerned, civilians and gears needed to work together and appear to be doing their part in front of each other. With orders for security to tighten up around here, the main operation room was moved from the main admin block to the gun placements themselves. The reason being, both Sander and Hoffman wanted to be as close to the fighting as possible so that way they can react as quickly as possible. The gun placements at their command, as far as they were concerned, were the very reason why Anvil Gates can still hope to stand out. The natural architecture of the infrastructure of course helped, but none of it had been updated to answer the call of modern warfare. Only the guns here have. As they were setting up, the situation continued to evolve as if open battle was already taking place here, albeit not as life-threatening. On a more serious note, the phone lines were down. Communications were evidently a high priority for whoever decided to block Anvil Gates in. Radio comms were still active, so the line between the garrison and COG High Command wasn't entirely severed, but it did bring a more personal human element to the forefront. None of these gears could reach their loved ones or the other way around. Likewise, the civilians of Anvil Gates had no way of reaching the outside world. This would, of course, bring up the interesting situation surrounding Sam Byrne, who jokingly talked about marrying his cash crate girlfriend, as he just discovered a few moments earlier, as it just so happened that she was pregnant. Now, if you haven't caught on by now, this is the father of Samantha Byrne from Gears of War 3. His girlfriend, Samantha's mother, who was named Shariah, was here with Sergeant Byrne, again working as a liaison between the civilians and the Gears. A massive blessing, as many Gears of course didn't have that close intimacy. Hoffman, well aware of how army life is, would tell him not to keep a girl waiting as she was expecting. Best he tie that knot now. Byrne, eager to make an honest woman out of her, but also fixated on the potential fight ahead, simply said, "To hell, we'll do it today." His excitement and Hoffman's own piece of advice to him made Hoffman begin to reflect. This would lead him to dismiss himself, grab some rations, which basically meant stuffing every square inch of his free space with ammunition and heading up to the gun floor. From here, he would find a quiet chamber, pulled out a notepad and turned over a clean page. He was beginning to write a letter to Margaret. This would be the beginning of a ritual he would perform every single day before battle in the event that he died. This letter would be passed on to her, recounting his final thoughts and words of affection to her before his time had finally come. He began the letter with, "If I don't come back at all." To him, it always felt theoretical and never as a final goodbye, which, funny enough, made him wonder that if it ever did manage to feel solid and inevitable, perhaps that was fate's way of telling him this was indeed a final goodbye. As he slowly disappeared into writing to his wife, pausing every few moments, struggling to find the right words, a nearby radio crackled. A Raven pilot, identifying themselves as KR-530, was reporting to Anvil Gate, informing them that they just caught 4 UIR artillery units and an infantry company moving fast out of Pora. Pora was 100 kilometers south of Anvil Gate. Between Pora and Anvil Gate, there was one of Vasgar's refineries. The UIR wouldn't need any men to take it, and thus, it won't really slow them down, more so work as a checkpoint for the gears to gauge how far and how fast the Indies were moving. Consequently, Sanders over Anvil Gate's intercom system would inform everyone they were now at Retcon 1. Anything outside of the walled city was now deemed hostile and cleared for engaging unless they identified themselves as friendlies. Sanders ended his announcement with the words, "Let's keep Anvil Gate's unbroken record gears," followed by the artillery crew instinctively loading up the fort's main guns. Batteries so large it made the usual artillery pieces, as massive as those were, look like pea shooters in comparison. Hell, the rounds Hoffman seen being loaded into these cannons really made the earlier 150mm rounds he seen being stashed everywhere look like they were regular Lancer rounds. Even watching Gears load these things made him chuckle, likening these massive soldiers carrying these much larger rounds to children playing with their father's tools. While Hoffman was staring at the guns being prepared, a young artillery sergeant by the name of Evan walked up beside him, and while stretching, he casually looks at his watch, and went on to say, "I give the Indies 2 hours max. With the right wind, I reckon we can hit the oil refineries from here. Even if they don't give us forward air control, we can still manage direct fire, and we can see 10 to 15 clicks easy should weather permit it. That's fine. But remember that if the Indies get close, their guns will be just as big as ours," Hoffman growled. "Yes, but our guns are bigger. It's 500 meters. At that range, we could easily stroll out and punch them in the face. 500 meters. Is that the maximum range?" Hoffman asked. "No," said Evan. "It's the gun's minimum range, sir." Taking a few minutes to think about the whole situation now was starting to make more sense to Hoffman. The whole plan, that was. If the Indy forces arrive at the refinery in 2 hours, blocking Anvil Gates from Kashkar meant that they didn't want COG reinforcements diverted east through Kashkar down the pass where Anvil Gates was and close in on them through a pincer movement. They wanted to concentrate on Shavad, keeping only one front of engagement open. Then they can work their way through Kashkar onto the emulsion fields and completely bypass Anvil Gate, making the whole garrison at Anvil Gate irrelevant. They were playing a much more patient game than Hoffman and the rest of the gears thought they were. The column of UIR troops in the distance were now visible by the cloud of dust their trucks were kicking up. It always amazed Hoffman just how fast modern vehicles can move on open country with no hurdles or resistance in their way. Captain Sanders, standing next to him, would ask him what he would do if he was in the UIR's position. Hoffman told him plainly, it really depends on how they think whatever's going on in Shavad. If Shavad somehow fell and they managed to overrun Kashkar, then the column's primary concern would be the garrison at Anvil Gate deciding to retreat, and thus sabotaging any refineries as they do so. The thought of which made Sanders chuckle. He didn't think anyone from the Royal 2-6 Tyrant Infantry ever retreated or surrendered. Gotta keep that motto of the unvanquished on Hoffman's camp bridge alive, after all. Even if that was true. Hoffman's concern wasn't the motto, but the sheer number of moving parts involved in the ever-growing complicated situation. Colonel Choi, back at battalion headquarters, rejected Anvil Gate's request to shell the refineries in the distance as a form of asset denial. The reason Choi gave was, well, there was a couple thousand workers at the refinery still. It was basically a large city, and as tempting as shelling it was, the idea of basically igniting millions of liters of fuel, consuming thousands of civilians in the blink of an eye, all for the small gain of stopping a relatively small Indy column, didn't make much practical sense. Then again, did Battalion HQ have any clear line of thinking? Shavad was becoming such an intense fight, radio comms all over Anvil Gates was keeping a close eye on everything happening there. Every helicopter in the entire region was being pulled in for support. This, of course, meant Anvil Gate would have no air support due to that. Then there was the constant chatter of injuries, carefully coordinated KC-VACs, ensuring choppers can land and airlift any 2-6 RTI or Sheriff cavalryman injured in battle. Considering the shit the rest of the Royal Tyrants were in, Hoffman's own unit after all, he was starting to feel his blood boil. He never felt so shortchanged in his entire life. Here he was, experienced, able-bodied, a veteran in these wars, reduced to a post where he can do nothing but just sit and listen. Those were his friends dying out there. And where was he? Hoping a small column in the distance will choose to attack? He'd take a deep sigh. There's going to be a lot of funerals he'd be attending when this is all over. Then again, Kashkir was just a single theater. If he decides to turn on the international radio, you can take your pick. Shivad may be going to hell in a handbasket right now, but it won't be found in the top 10 news stories of today. Consequently, Anvagad, a choke point that no commander in his right mind would ever try to attack, would never be told in history books. Just like he is right now, this little garrison will be forgotten to history. Almost as if to shake off that reality, Hoffman decided to be as proactive as he could. Going out for a patrol with a small number of gears, he would also send out Patrick Sultan and his team of snipers to set up observation posts 5 kilometers south of Anvagad. In the meantime, Sanders would put out a request for Pesang support. If this campaign was going to be dragged on and fought on this type of terrain with no eyes in the sky, then their best bet would be some skilled mountain fighters. About an hour later, more news from both Shivad and the approaching Indy column would come in. Patrick and his team were able to provide a visual confirmation on this column of Indy troops coming from the refinery. The force consisted of 6 self-propelled guns, a dozen tanks, some APCs, some big armored supply trucks, and what looked to be a low loader with tarps all over it. If Patrick was a betting man, he said it was most likely carrying a track-laying vehicle. But then again, it appeared to be a bit thin to the ground for any serious attempt to break through the pass. Hoffman would order Patrick to keep a close eye on them. He didn't want to get caught off guard. If they decide to break off and head north of the refinery, the vintage guns here at Anvil Gate would take care of them. On the other hand, news from Shivad was continuing to roll in. This is important because it would go on to provide a clearer picture on what was happening at Anvil Gate that Hoffman and the other gears just couldn't see. Engineers at Shivad were reporting that the UIR had to deploy special forces behind their lines into Kashkir before they ever invaded Vasgar. Daniel Vari's announcement of peacekeepers being sent into neutral territory now sounded like it was just a giant ploy to keep the COG facing south, allowing their enemies to set a proper trap and slip troops into the country without anybody noticing. By the amount of sabotage COG engineers at Shivad were facing, the UIR's work had to have taken some time. Apparently, there's also UIR snipers positioned all over Shivad, making movement that much harder for both evacuating the injured and bringing in supplies to keep the city under the COG's control. This also meant that receiving a big piece of mining equipment from Lakar, necessary to move the mound of rubble the Indies brought down on the road to Anvil Gates, will only take that much longer to come. A damn shame. Anvil Gates really was becoming less and less of a priority. To lighten the mood, Evan, slapping the large part of a cannon's barrel as if petting the neck of a racehorse, went on to say, "They say that an Indian COG guard post once faced each other across a border for 10 years, and they didn't so much as exchange a single shot. I forget where it was. I bet they did too." A perfect way to summarize the feeling here at Anvil Gate. Captain Sanders, leaning up against the wall, pushed himself away and stretched his back. "I'm just going to put out a call to brigade command about the behemoth to move that rubble. If Shivad does fall, they'll need that route open one way or another." As he turned toward the steel door that led down the stairs, he got halfway across the gun floor when Hoffman heard a shout, followed by Sander being heard casually asking, "What the hell is that?" Oh shit. Then, the entire gun floor was suddenly engulfed in an instantly blinding yellow light. Hoffman heard the whoosh of a backdraft, 2 loud bangs like a car crash, and the air around him explode. Something hit the back of his head, his mouth filled with a searing pain. He could taste blood. And then he suddenly felt the cold stone underneath his cheek. He couldn't hear a damn thing, nor could he move though. He could have sworn he was flailing his arms trying to get up, but he still wasn't moving. Then, as if someone snapped sound back into existence, Hoffman could hear again. He heard the garrison siren first, and then panting screams, followed by a strange gong-like sound. Everything else was just noise akin to it all being muffled underwater. But he could see. He realized he was looking at what he believed was Evan's face. Nothing more than a mass of blood and pale gray dust. Evan's gunner was shouting over Hoffman, but he couldn't register what he was really saying. All he knew was that he was shouting. After some straining, he was able to finally get his brain to click with what the gunner was saying. He was yelling at Hoffman to get up. The Indies just launched a rocket at them. They're behind them. They've taken up firing positions from Kashgar. Someone else who Hoffman couldn't see would attempt to grab him and pull him up to his feet. Though severely dazed, he would fall back to the ground right on top of Evan. As he looked around trying to work out what the hell was happening, all he could see was a giant mess. Blast marks, blood, an armor backplate, black fabric. Someone must have been hit by some kind of direct shot, that much was obvious. As he's still trying to piece this image together, he's aggressively pulled upright. Brought to his feet, Hoffman became even more confused. It was Evan who had picked him up, so who the hell was a dead body he just fell on top of? Well, as Evan shoved him into a door to get him out of the open, Evan was yelling, "Captain Sander was just killed." A lone Indie climbed up on the rocks from behind the city, on Kashgar's side, and fired an RPG straight into the observation window. The fact Hoffman, Evan, or anyone else that was in that tight room is still alive is a miracle. That type of explosion in such a confined space should have meant there was absolutely no survivors. It explains just how badly Hoffman was concussed. And he knows he was severely concussed because he kept thinking, why nobody didn't fire any guns back? He was struggling to still focus on what exactly was going on, and it felt like everything around him was far away, despite him staring straight at it. But thankfully, instinct would take over. He missed his first two attempts to get his fingers to click in his earpiece. When he finally did, he tried to get into contact with Byrne and Sultan. He ordered both of them to get out there and find out who in the world fired that rocket. Then he ordered the gunners to put a crew together to make sure their guns are still operational. And finally, he needed someone to have constant eyes on the refinery because he can't see straight. The final point was true. He knew he was badly injured, but with Sander dead, no one else but him can really keep this garrison together. Injured or not, he needed to be on autopilot, the part of himself that just moves off the years of experience that he has. That's all he needs to make sure that he can do in order to keep the situation from going bad to worse. Yet admittedly, he couldn't help but wonder about two occurring themes that really were not that important in the moment. The first was the glass of his watch was broken. He couldn't see the second hand. Such a damn shame. The other, he had no idea what the hell he was going to say to Sanders' wife. She was pregnant, and Hoffman just lost a 23-year-old captain under his watch. After coming to his senses, well enough to move that is, Hoffman would go down to the medical bay where the chance of their wounded felt unfavorable to say the least. Anvigad's main doctor specialized in fractures and liver flukes, the only kind of injuries that really ever happened in this backwater of the world. Or there was of course occasional treatment of goats. That's about as far as this doctor's experience went. But now he was working on a gear and trying his best to keep this gear from bleeding to death. Hoffman watched almost as if he was in a daze as the doctor shook his head, probing around this gear's open abdomen, doing his best to instruct battery medics where to clamp down next. Catching a wooden chair in the corner, Hoffman would sit down and began to tolerate basic first aid from a private while on the radio set with HQ. When they picked up on the other line, the first thing they said to him without Hoffman saying a single word was they can't send any help to Anvigad, at least not for a while. As it stands, KC-Vax for Shavad are priority, and that's still difficult as it is to do right now. But Hoffman wasn't asking for help. He simply wanted to keep HQ updated on their situation. As of now, they aren't under sustained attack, they have adequate supplies and ammo for the time being. The thing to keep an eye out for is the rocket they were just hit with came from Kashgar, possibly Indies inserted before invading Vasgar, just like the Indies attacking Shavad were believed to have been inserted before. Then there's a casualty list. Hoffman would share Sander was dead, gunners Dufour, Tovey, and Pole were also dead, and they're dealing with 8 more gears injured. 2 critically, and civilians are trapped with them thanks to the road being blocked. There was a small silver lining out of everything here though. HQ would share a Pasenga recon team had in fact been put together. That gave everyone hope here. The Pasenga lived in this sort of terrain and were incredibly feared. One single Pasenga, as Hoffman put it, could cover the same amount of ground in the same amount of time that it'll take 5 years to do so. If the Indies that launched the rocket was hiding out in these rock formations, the Pasenga will find him. The only problem they have to deal with right now is it'll take some time for the Pasenga to get deployed to Anvil Gate. That is, of course, once the question of how they're going to get deployed is answered. Concluding the call, Hoffman went to stand up. Shariah and the private administering first aid to him both instinctively sat him back down. And as they did so, Shariah would correct Hoffman, saying they actually got 9, not 8 injured gears. That included Hoffman. He would attempt to give some pushback, arguing he needed to get back out there and take control of the situation of Anvil Gates. But after noticing Shariah appeared to be looking past him and not directly at him, he began to think about just how much the private working on him was using so much surgical tape for the back of his head. He had yet to actually see the damage for himself, so leaving it all in the hands of the ones who perhaps knew a little bit better here, he'd relent. If he hit his head as hard as they think he did, it'd only take a few hours for him to collapse and die from it, so best to be cautious here. As he was just about coming to accept relaxing and being worked on, he noticed the doctor's mood change into a quiet panic. Meanwhile, the private working on him slapped his shoulder and said, "Just as well that you shaved your head before all this happened. It makes his kind of work on you that much easier." The gear, without knowing it, inadvertently sets Hoffman right back into action. He couldn't sit here in the first aid station any longer. He had more than a platoon to run, more than a garrison, more than an entire city. He had to hold Anvil Gate, and as it stood, he still had no idea what they were really facing. He reached for his headset that he had taken off and now placed it right back on top of his head, sliding it over the bandages that had just been applied and reaching out to Patrick Sultan. He and Sam Byrne had been searching the slopes around the fort. The pair had even recruited a local who had experience in climbing and some equipment to make it all easier. According to Patrick, they haven't found anything on either side of the mountain flanking Anvil Gate, and there weren't any signs of any vehicles either. But he did give Hoffman a suggestion. He thought it best that they set up an observation post to give them a 360-degree view. Hoffman approved the idea, as they both came to the same conclusion that the Indies over the border may very well be the least of their worries. Then Hoffman contacted Evan. Right here, right in front of Shariah, he chose his words carefully, asking if Evan had made any progress and needed any assistance. What he was referring to was, how was his progress on clearing up all of the dead bodies? Identifying who and putting them in the proper respectful place until the road was finally cleared. It did bug Hoffman that he wasn't in the state to do this instead of Evan. The reason being that those were Evan's friends. The memories he would have of collecting his friends' dead bodies and cog tags will last him for years, coming back vividly to him when he least expected it. Hoffman wanted to protect as many gears from such horrors as often as he could. Evan responded with a shaky voice, but did seem to still be in control, reporting simply that the guns don't dent that easy. He'd also add that he's been keeping an eye on the refinery. No movement so far. It was clear to Hoffman that Evan was going through it, but like all gear suffering personal loss in the field, you just have to carry on. That is until you get a moment to yourself and mourn quietly, and perhaps just maybe question why it hadn't been you. Speaking of loss, as if right on cue, the doctor took a deep sigh on the other side of the room and announced to Hoffman that he failed. The hemorrhaging continued, and despite his best efforts, this young man has died on his table. Feeling as if the situation is collapsing before anything has really actually happened yet, Hoffman announces to everyone that the city will continue to stay on lockdown. Falling into his usual routine, his mind began to fill with everything he needed to take care of. As far as the usual things go, that is. There's burial details, pay corps, and next of kin to inform. He wasn't sure if the locals buried anybody here or if they were cremated. He knew the gear who just died and his family would want his body sent back home, same as Sander. The rest was part of the massive unknown to him. But for now, he ordered temporary graves to be set up and the Anvil Gate City Council to be organized so modifications could be added to the official lockdown. It was a decision that he actually questioned a minute later because he didn't know if it was really worth warning the civilians on what he wanted to do next, or if it was just in his best interest and everybody else to just do it. His justification for it all was, well, let's work out the basis of the situation, and that is, they're surrounded. And then he reflected. When he was knocked to the ground, he heard sirens, which meant the warning sirens were triggered. If they were ever triggered, the gear should be expecting the firing to start. The only oddity within this entire situation was that the firing didn't keep going. It was just a single blast, and the person that fired disappeared. But since those alarms were triggered, that really shouldn't mean anything here. So just as Hoffman was putting out an order for all teams and battery crews to remain on standby, Evan cut into the radio. He reported the Indy tanks are now moving out. They could only be heading to one place, or getting into position to shell them at Anvil Gate. Hoffman immediately was more concerned about Indies actually infiltrating quietly, especially with everyone's focus on the advancing armor now. No matter, Lieutenant Hoffman told him to show these Indy assholes the cog mean business, telling him, "Start as we mean to go on, Sergeant," a phrase that Evan knew exactly what it meant. It was a green light to open fire as soon as the prime opportunity came. The heights of Anvil Gates will serve him and the battery crews well. They were so high up, anything coming up to the gates would practically be right below them. Any gear with a working pair of eyes could adjust their guns accordingly to what they seen thanks to Anvil Gate's elevation, and hence no spotter was needed. It should make raining down hell on whoever all the easier for them. Of course, this was no secret. The Indies could see that just as well as the cog knew, and really, the height of Anvil Gates was a deterrent for both sides. As we said before, for the garrison it'd be akin to shooting fish in a barrel. For the Indies, a forward charge was them hoping they could convince the garrison they were insane, and to think twice about engaging such a fearless enemy, but it didn't work. A few minutes later, the first UIR tank crossed the border from Vasgar into Kashgar, a distance of only 7 kilometers. Hoffman officially gave the order to fire for effect. Having a brief moment of reflection, it was funny for him to hear himself say that. It was an artillery procedure, a simple line that was about all that he could recall for fire discipline. He was an infantry grunt through and through, and now he just gave orders for gunners that probably knew better on what their objectives were and what was the primary targets and why. This was their garrison after all. He was just here to make sure nothing happened to them. Considering Sander and the other 8 casualties, he felt like he already failed at that job though. As he began to beat himself up about not sending out to patrol earlier to catch that RPG before it ever got launched into the fort, Anvil Gate's massive batteries fired. Nothing in the entire world, not even Hoffman's years of experience of fighting in the front lines, could have prepared him for what Anvil Gate's batteries sounded like. To him, it felt as if the entire planet was hit by a massive earthquake, and the floor beneath his feet shifted, jolted, and reverberated all at once. Then there was the sound. It actually hurt. It shot from his ears down to his chest, resonated there, and then bounced back up to his teeth, making his whole jaw shake violently. He then heard Evan in his earpiece say, "Shot out," followed by a moment of pure, unnerving silence. A gear by the name of Gerald, a nice enough private, responded with the word "splash," and then said, "1 tank, 2 APCs destroyed. Other targets are dispersing, sir." Hoffman strained to see what they actually hit in the distance. What he could make out was a column of long black smoke rising into the air, then the UIR troops spreading out into a long, ragged line. From what he can tell, they actually came to a halt. Evan, over the radio, could be heard giving a small chuckle to himself, saying, "What we just did was a bit overkill, sir, but they definitely got the message." The guns he just fired were the massive cannons Hoffman had seen earlier. Relics of the past, really. The only other place you can find similar cannons were on old COG battleships. A piece of history in their own right, and perhaps the Indies were just trying to make heads or tails of what the hell just hit them, because no one really faces or uses such monsters these days. The tanks and other armored units were roughly 6,000 kilometers away, when Hoffman saw a flash and a belch of white smoke. A few seconds later, an explosion had shook the fortress, knocking chunks of the cliff slope right beneath the observation post. In response, Anvil Gate's smaller 150mm guns opened up, and just like that, the war had finally reached Anvil Gate. Now, Hoffman had been under fire more times than he can count, more times than he can even bother to remember, but everything now was sinking in. This was entirely different for him. He was in a fortress, standing still, and taking whatever the enemy threw at him. There was no such thing as disengaging, moving to find a better position, or just getting the hell out of the damn way. True, he was on a peak defended by impregnable rock. However, what seemed like advantages were now disadvantages too. For example, the line of sight Anvil Gate provided was 300 degrees around the fortifications. The enemy cannot see inside the fortress without aerial recon, but the defenders of said fort can also not see fully either. Where they can see is only provided with just enough space for shooting angles, not information gathering. So if someone is trying to sneak around or slowly creep up, they wouldn't know any better. More shells continued to thud into the fortifications, shaving off rocks all around them. making an immense amount of noise while doing so, but Anvil was quite literally shrugging it all off, responding similarly by pounding the UIR column with their 150mm shells until an entire cloud of smoke seemed to blanket the entire open plain. It made Hoffman wonder though, why the hell a relatively small UIR column would throw their lives away to face Anvil head on. It didn't make any sense. He couldn't see any additional armor units coming in the distance, it was just them. Anvil Gates can literally sit here and smack down anything coming at it directly, just as it has done for centuries, swapping archers and catapults for cannonballs and then for shells. It's been here since before the invention of gunpowder and cannons, and so as humanity and the times continue to evolve, really, as far as Anvil and Anvil Gates is concerned, it was all the same. Though deciding to not risk the external gantries, Hoffman decided to head deeper into the city of Anvil to see how the civilians were holding up. And let's just say Hoffman likened it to being uncomfortably close to dumb complacency. The streets weren't vacant, there was definitely less people about, but they were acting like a regular day was going on, delivering essentials, chatting about Anvil invincibility, and just how these indies will regret what they're doing. True, indie gunners will have a hard time getting those shells over the fort's walls into the city, but again, no one knows who fired that first RPG or how he got so close. He proved he can take opportunistic shots at tall vulnerable structures, and that threat is still active until they find out who the hell did it. The steady thumping of artillery fire suddenly became background noise as Hoffman decided to go and check on the Sandgar manned by his own gears. As he was moving, he did catch a different sound of artillery but completely dismissed it. However, the second one was met with his gears yelling, "Incoming mortars." The explosion threw up a column of flame and smoke as if it had gone off right next to him. Debris fragments of roof slate, hissing metal, and wood splinters all showered down on top of Hoffman. He ducked behind a wall, covering his head for a moment, then ran to the nearest Sandgar. He climbed up on a short ladder where he found 3 gears were inside, crouched behind a rocket screen, all looking down below the walls with field glasses. Hoffman demanded to know where the hell that last explosion came from. He could hear Anvil small firefighting force honking its vehicle horns. Struggling to move through the narrow streets, many of Anvil old buildings were actually made of wood. In hindsight, it was nothing more than a bundle of wood waiting for a match to come and be placed against it, lighting the whole thing in an instant. One of the 3 gears surveying the land with the field glasses, while still looking to see where that shot had come from, went on to explain that it came from the north. It definitely wasn't from Vasgar. Hearing they're under attack from Kashgar's side of the border again, Hoffman instinctively pressed his radio to establish contact with Byrne, requesting to know where his sergeant was. Sam would immediately respond, informing Hoffman he's up in the monastery tower, setting up a few small guns there with the intention of covering the dead area between Anvil Gates and the open space on Kashgar's side of the border. At least Hoffman and Sam both sounded to be on the same page, both coming to the conclusion that exactly what Hoffman had feared turned out to be the case. The frontal assault was to keep them busy while they moved in from behind. Sam would pause for a second, and then in a brutally pragmatic moment, he went on to acknowledge the Indies from behind firing mortars into the fort will end up with a number of civilian casualties. The Indies won't take the city, but if Anvil firefighter team can't get the fires under control, then much of the city is going to burn down, save for the structures that are made of stone. The other options currently facing them is having Carlisle rig some motor grillage into the buildings, and then come nighttime cut out all the lights. If they block out the city, they could move around under the cover of darkness, but there was too the certainty of then the UIR firing blindly into the forts, which comes with its own chances that they're going to be taking. The UIR can pretty much bank off the guarantee that they're going to hit something no matter what. The question is how bad the damage is. And so Hoffman continued to weigh out his options. Worst case scenario, as far as Hoffman was concerned, Anvil still had food, water, electricity, and if things got really bad, he could send the civilians to take cover deep into the underground network tunnels deep within the rock formations. Theoretically speaking, Anvil Gates can hold out for a couple of weeks. By then, the Battle of Shavad would undoubtedly be decided, and thus Anvil's fate will be officially decided. As the situation at Anvil Gates was slowly ramping up, I want to cover the Brigade of Pesang a little bit here. Baitak, pictured here, had just enlisted into the Cog army, Signing into 5 years, he gave his struggling wife the money he was given as a way to support herself, hire some help back at the farm if need be, and hopefully ease the pain of him leaving. As for him, he was still getting used to everything. Food was much more accessible and in larger quantities than he was ever used to. A bigger privilege here was that a lot of the food that he was being served was meat, a massive rarity these days as Pasenga was being hit by a heavy drought affecting the cattle. Then there was the terminology. Words like us and we to him was now meaning people outside of Pasenga, building a strong sense of camaraderie across the entire cog, no matter where anyone came from. The next step was the technology the cog had. Baitak was only used to barely lit wooden shacks. Now he was thrown into armories fully lit and shiny to the point of him being worried of leaving fingerprints anywhere. And finally, there was learning how to properly use a lancer, a massive thing by Pasenga standards. Now, really we can cover Baitak and Paseng later, as there's quite a bit of information here, but the point here is he's still in basic training. He's so new, in fact, that he's barely learning that it's smart to not overeat as it affects your field performance. And it's here, right in the middle of basic training, that one day while out on the shooting range, rifle training was abruptly paused by a major who surprisingly spoke very good Paseng. Without providing much information, he simply said that he was looking for 6 volunteers, men who, as the major put it, was used to moving around mountains without being seen and can easily track other men without being caught, or let on that the men that they're tracking was being watched. The major admittedly knew that most Paseng can do that, but the reason why he was looking for 6 volunteers specifically was because these men were going to be put in potentially dangerous territory and must live in the wilderness, most likely without any form of support for weeks at the bare minimum. The first one to raise their hands here was a Paseng by the name of Cho Lagan, who simply said, "I can do that, sir, with or without a rifle." Next was Lauen, a man a little younger than Baitak, and then there was Baitak not wanting to leave his new buddies in the military behind. Baitak would raise his hand saying, "Sir, I come from the borders and we had a lot of trouble with Shaoshi raiding our herds. I'm good at ambushes." Shaoshi were the neighboring people of the Pasengos who often pillaged and stole from the Paseng, leading to the Paseng having to forge the fierce mountain fighting reputation that they have cultivated seemingly over the millennia. Responding to Baitak, the officer smiled and said, "Ah, so you know what this job requires. Good man. Anyone else?" Lao then added that he can track and is an expert climber as well. The officer then just rubbed his hands together and completely overtaken with sheer joy said that this is why he loves the Pasenga so much. They're always willing to give something a go. Then he tells the men report to the quartermaster in a half hour to receive their kits, and from there, they're headed to Kashkar. The news of where they were going slowly sunk in. It was the inherent problem of volunteering without knowing what the hell you were actually getting yourself into. Kashkar, as far as the Paseng knew, was a major theater of war with all eyes on Shavad. That's where Baitak thought he was going. Reports on the 2-6 RTI and Sheriff's Cavalry suffering many casualties and struggling to keep a foothold on the city was reported every single day. But the bigger concern was Cho walking over to Baitak and whispering that he was nuts. He hadn't even qualified with his Lancer yet and is already being sent off to potentially die. Cho had some experience in the field, so he had an idea of what they were heading into, but again, none of these men had the slightest idea of Anvil Gates being a place they'd actually be sent to. A blip on a map that no one would really notice unless you looked closely or were planning for some sort of campaign in advance there. About an hour later, Baitak and the other 5 Paseng volunteers found themselves inside the noisy bay of a vehicle they were told to call a chopper or bird, and struggling to adapt to earpieces they found to be itchy. It wasn't until right before they were deployed, roughly 5 minutes out, that they were finally told what their objective was and where they were going. First thing was, they're going to be dropped off to the north of the fort. It's currently getting shelled hard. Head south undetected, and when within range to use their radios to ID themselves, or else the gears inside will open fire. None of the gears stationed inside of the fort were expected to speak Paseng, so best they can do now is practice their call sign to ensure they at least don't get shot before their mission starts. When they do head into the fort, they're to report to Lieutenant Hoffman. He'll give them more detailed instructions, but as a crash course, the Pasengas are going to be looking for the enemy. Draw a map for the gears of where they are, or, if the opportunity presents itself, to kill the enemy themselves. Oh, and despite the language barrier between the Paseng and the gears, the pilot would inform them that when gears are scared, they all collectively say one word in Tyrant. So keep an eye out for that word as it indicates some sort of danger. And that word was
shit.
If they hear him say it, best to look towards the nearest gear and follow his moves accordingly, especially because based off these 6 volunteers' experience, that gear most likely knows something they don't. Following his movements will most likely save their lives. The helicopter touched down on the outcrop just long enough for the men to jump out and struggle to drag their oversized backpacks with them. Then all of a sudden, these 6 men were all alone, looking straight up into a smoky violet dusk across wilderness. Apart from the smoke and the smell of gunpowder lingering in the air, if they closed their eyes, it really did feel just like home. From where they were dropped off, they could see the fort outlined by 2 massive guns, making it easy enough to head in the correct direction. After a few steps though, Cho ordered, with a simple hand sign, all the Pasengas to stop. Dropping low to the ground, as low as possible, they began to all listen. To them, you couldn't miss it. It was movement, particularly from the sound of a gear's boots crunching against gravel, a noise that Paseng described as stupid and clumsy. The person they can hear moving was trying to be quiet, but the Pasengas had super hearing. They knew it was a gear, and Bai could even hear the creaks of leather straps and scuff of metal. The distinct noise of a rifle being held a bit too close to someone's body. Creeping, but where? Then, a massive explosion lit up the sky, and Baitek found himself staring up at a man in full armor about to step on him. Bai could see a glimpse of red hair and a face covered in blue swirls. He almost yelled. He'd never seen anything like it. He's never seen anyone outside of the Pesang or Gears. But before he could react, the man spoke. He said, "Holy fuck, you nearly made me shit myself. You little fuckers don't make any noise, do you?" What the man said, Bai really had no clue, but he could tell what he spoke was Tyrant, and this man was indeed a gear. Mustering up about all the Tyrant he had, he saluted and reported as Private Baitak, going on to say in broken Tyrant that they're Pasenga. 6 Pasenga. Do you want help? Damn right we do. Come on, I'll take you to meet the CLO. And I'm Pad, by the way. Private Patrick Sultan. As luck had it, the chopper dropped the Pasenga right by Pad's observation post that he set up only a few hours earlier, and no one knew that this landing zone was so close to a gear. As Patrick started leading the men back to the fort, he couldn't help but keep glancing at Baitak's machete, asking if it was true that once a Pasenga draws their blade, their folklore refuses for them to sheath it until they decapitated someone. Now, since Bai didn't have enough Tyrant in his vocabulary to properly respond, despite pretty much understanding what Pat had asked, he simply just flashed a grin. And truthfully, he was indeed much more comfortable with his machete than a lancer. But this led to Pat responding by simply saying, "Damn, you love your work. We're gonna get along just fine. Good to know we finally have some cavalry after all." Now, Hoffman's first impression was a bit more worrisome, though. The arrival of the Pasenga was the first time he ever met one, and while they had the reputation that they did, these men were tiny, and they looked far too young. Most gears seem to be young now these days, but even compared to those gears, the Pasenga looked innocently young. They didn't have proper armor, and then their infamous machetes seemed to be too big for them. Baitak again would be the first one to speak up, saying in broken Tyrant, "They don't speak so good, but they understand okay. You give job, we do job." Then he went on to report as Rifleman Baitak and introduced the rest of the crew. Riflemen Laoen, Cholagan, Jati Shai, Jishim, and Narufen. For whatever reason, Hoffman immediately took a liking to Baitek. His first order was to have Patrick find them some proper armor, though, as he thought that he can't send these men out on patrols in what was practically their underwear to him. Trying to get the message across to Baitak, he jabbed him in the center of his own chest plate, saying, "Heavy plate, you need more armor and proper boots." Again, it took Bai a minute to understand, seemingly flashing through his entire Tyrant vocabulary, mentally trying to understand what the hell he was just told, until his face lit up. It clicked. He said, "No more armor. How we move around all quiet." Then he gestured to Hoffman's boots, adding, "How we climbing those? We fall and get damn dead, sir." That's a good point. The response gave Hoffman hope that they knew what they were doing after all. So he ordered them to get fed, supplied, and then report for briefing. Patrick would lead them away, but not before informing Hoffman that they appear to be a little light on ammo, while gesturing his finger across his throat in a slicing motion. He really did seem to enjoy the kind of brutality these men could bring to even out the odds, even on a more personal basis. Hoffman didn't care though. It didn't matter to him how much ammo they burned. His main concern was the Indies to the north in the mountains raining down motors. He has yet to lose anyone to the frontal assault. It's all just been the motors from behind them and the RPG, which means Anvil Gates will stand so long as the mountains are cleared, which in turn lets patrols go out and give peace of mind for when Anvil Gates does finally get some form of support. Truthfully, a lot of it was still figuring out what the hell the Indies' game was. The frontal assault was being met with the 150mm guns and now belt-fed stompers. Their large guns were only fired twice, which pushed back the Indie main artillery pieces just a few kilometers, but the frontal assault isn't keeping sustained fire on Anvil Gates, and what they do shoot is too short or right behind them into the cliffside. Granted, the height of the fort made it difficult to drop shots over the wall into the city, but at the same time, if they did insert troops behind them into the hilly countryside, it would explain their shooting patterns as being cautious to not hit their own men. They just didn't seem to be trying, though. There's also the chance of the Indies just holding the refinery and trying to keep the garrison locked in place. That plan does make sense based off the current actions. Though still trying to understand it definitively, Hoffman decided to check in with Evan, who was greasing up the large guns again. Before saying anything, Evan would share that he does think he knows what the Indies are up to. If you look in the distance, the refinery, normally visible as a constellation of white, amber, and red stars on the horizon, was now pitch black, so it was still offline. But the UIR vehicles were clearly visible, at least their lights gave them away. Evan thinks they're trying to make Anvil Gate waste all of their ordnance, which brought up the question, are they dealing with suicide troops, which was a real possibility, but Hoffman didn't buy into that. They were basically sitting within range and inviting death by shelling. Even gears weren't that insane, and usually when they do something that doesn't make all that much sense, it's usually within a do or die moment and isn't drawn out the way that this appears to be. But then Evan reminded him that sailors from Tanad once piloted little suicide submarines. It was their choice, but they weren't aware that the UIR welded the hatches shut. So if those initial sane guys changed their minds, which most of them did, they had no choice but to carry on. Then Evan pointed out the movement of the lights in the distance. The vehicles were just milling around. Nothing unusual in of itself. They could just be ferrying fuel from the refinery to their vehicles. But if you look closer, and forcing themselves to rethink their approach, it all looked differently. The movement of the lights that they thought were vehicles seemed odd. It was odd because they were moving in predictable fixed intervals following each other in open loops. They're decoys. Okay, but if that's the case, Hoffman argued there were two flaws in said theory if those lights were really decoy trucks. One, the lead vehicle is a live driver, and in the initial barrage, that was the one they hit. Two, the vehicles they destroyed earlier were definitely being driven based off their own patterns. It was too sporadic, akin to people panicking. They were moving on their own power and not being towed like these decoys seem to be. Evan shared that you can rig a vehicle to push as well as hard tow something, and the first guy that they hit most likely underestimated the range of their guns and how accurate they really were. It would make sense then that the UIR actually got the message quick and didn't want to make that same mistake again. And at night, nobody can confirm if these moving lights are really vehicles. Sappers rig dummy lights to look like a number of installations all the time. It's low tech and sounds stupid, but it does work really well at night. Indies could be using it to tempt them. Plus, if they're looking that way, who's to say what's happening behind them? They aren't as dumb as they thought they were, and it does make more sense. Because again, as Hoffman thought, why would anyone attack this place head on? Oh, and then there's one more thing. The more they fire the guns, the more they would need to be recalibrated. Otherwise, they become less and less accurate. This is something the UIR has to know. These guns can handle about 300 full charges of firing before they need recalibration. And as of now, they're around 200. Replenishment of ammo and realigning of these guns is going to be their main concern. And so the UIR strategy appears to be attrition, diversion, isolation. That may just be about the simplest way their strategy can be explained from how everything lines up right now. Anvil Gates, economically speaking, can hold out as of now, as water was unlimited and food and ammo was set to last roughly 12 days. Hoffman would retire to both update HQ on his current position as well as brief the Pasenga on what their orders were. Staring at the large swaths of land and mountain that they needed to cover on a map, it seemed a bit too much for just 6 men. That was until Bytag confidently told him this is no problem for them, and it's much easier for them to cover this much ground under night. While discussing the plan, everyone heard a distant explosion. Thinking it was from the emulsion fields from Kashgar, Hoffman would ask HQ if they knew anything about it. They got back rejecting any news and promising to keep Hoffman updated. And so not thinking any more of it, Hoffman returned to briefing the Pasenga. Until a few minutes later, Sam walked in, reporting that the baker within town said his water mill stopped working. Carlisle looked down in the cisterns and they're not filling up either. The underground river that flowed through Anvagad's bedrock has been harnessed and rerouted to run the water wheels in some parts of town. That river was a roaring torrent all year round. The city basically being worked around it and using it for power was one of the things that made Anvagad impregnable. If it all suddenly stopped, it only meant something horrible has happened, and that being that the UIR had just blocked the river. That explosion they heard was them doing just that. And now the Battle of Anvil Gate fully transitioned into a full-on siege. About 3 days later, Carlisle and Bitek would go out and recon the river quietly. What was once giant impressive waterfalls was now nothing more than foamy puddles. Easy for Bitek enough to confirm this was the work of someone diverting the rivers elsewhere. The Shyoshi did this to the Pasengas often. And apart from that, the conclusion Bai came to was if help from HQ doesn't come soon, Anvil Gates is going to have a very hard time. Not necessarily the Pasengas, as out here, they can hunt for small animals. Even the grazing wild goats is good meat. Gears technically can too. But the civilians, all 5,000 of them, are going to have to learn how to ration aggressively. In terms of food and water, who really knows? By now the Pasengas were being sent out on patrol every night as well. Their main task was to catch any Indies around the fort, and apart from the explosions and obvious evidence Gears can pick up on the UIR being around, the Pasengas could find smaller things that gave them away. For instance, Bitek would actually smell them. Their sense gave him a good idea of where they were holding up, especially thanks to places they'd want to keep an eye on. For instance, if the Gears wanted to reroute the river back to Anvagad, based off their smell and those vantage points, Bitek and the other Pasengas would immediately be able to know where a UIR soldier would be hiding. Bitek was also able to find places they slept, where they took leaks, even noting that whatever the UIR's diet was, it gave their urine a very distinct smell. He would chuckle to himself that these men were careless by Pasenga standards. There's no way in hell they could be special forces. It's way too easy for him to pick up the smallest things. No matter, when the Pasengas went on patrols, they split out into 3 pairs fanning out from the fort on 3 sides. One night, while heading out with Cho, after a couple of hours, Bai can hear the sound of small stones moving. A crunch and then a sliding noise. He and Cho would drop to the ground to minimize their own noise, and then slowly rise back up. After a moment, they would pinpoint that this noise was coming from their right. Even under the cover of a moonless night, they can both tell what they were looking at was indeed a man. The man had something small on his back and was moving into a position that was level with the fort's walls. He was actually setting up a mortar. And so this was one of those moments where a hard decision needed to be made. In a few moments, that motor can devastate Anvil Gate. However, there was no telling if there were Indies just beyond eyesight. Bitek and Cho can shoot the guy from where they were, but then the sound will be heard all across the entire pass. As Bai looked at Cho, he had the same thought process. They both slowly began to unsheath their machetes, and then they split up, creeping up on the man from 2 different sides. Even as the guy was scanning slowly left to right, he didn't notice that he was staring directly at Bitek a few times. And while he was creeping up on him, Bai was trying to work out how he was going to kill his first man. He came to the conclusion that none of this throat-slicing business, as that felt inhumane. He had experience with slicing with enough force behind his machete that it'll cut as well as stun a small animal, hoping that that same technique will work on a man. But then the guy he was eyeing apparently recognized Cho, and as he reacted to Cho, Bai on the other side of him moved, slamming his machete into his skull. The thwack noise of the impact was so much more than Bai had ever expected it to be, and the man's skull gave so much more resistance when he fell over that the machete's handle slipped out of Bitek's hands, as the blade stood embedded in the guy's skull. As he retrieved his blade, Cho went on to disassemble the motors and took the UIR's guns. Thinking it incredibly terrifying to finding your buddy in a pool of his own blood without a sound being made, all while his equipment is gone. It was a psychological tactic. Plus, if they hauled more equipment up here, it'll slow them down even more, which was perfect for Pasenga and Kag alike. As Cho and Bitek retreated into the cover of the grass, Bai cleaned off his machete with some water. He needed to, otherwise the blood will mess up his sheath. The whole time he reflected on his first kill, he felt numb, stuck in disbelief that killing a man could be so easy. This night they wouldn't find any more UIR patrols, but that wouldn't mean the end of their excitement for the night. Returning to Anvil Gate at dawn, the Gears were in awe at the motor and rifle Cho brought back, commenting on how none of them had heard a single thing. Patrick even showed up, winking at Cho, asking if he was saving ammo again. The rifle he had was beautiful. It was a UIR sniper rifle in perfect condition, a trophy that Cho made clear was Bai's, as it was his kill after all. Hoffman was losing it. Running a city was so much harder than combat. Preferring the latter any day of the week, it was anticipating all the little things that made civilians scared that was so hard for him to take into account. Had Hoffman not started rationing as early as he did, they'd be out of food by now. Water rationing was now a daily routine. Right when the sun rose, queues started to form at the water tanks on the main street. People were given 15 liters on the basis of a desperate call to a refugee agency office in New Temperance. But Anvil Gate had no survival plan as glamorous as that, and that was thanks to no one ever thinking the river was going to be dry or blocked. It was giving Hoffman a newfound appreciation for army engineers. The UIR's engineers ruined his whole plan without so much as picking up a single rifle. For Anvil Gate, the water rations were based off your ID card. No ID card meant no water. When you received water, a city official would mark it to indicate that you got water for that day. Nobody was allowed to come back twice in a single day. And by now, the shelling of the UIR was sporadic. It was more so designed as a psychological ploy to make sure the city didn't stay complacent or fall into any rhythm of comfort. There was also talk of dissension, primarily from a city councilman by the name of Alderman Buyal Kasani. He was the one that Sander had initially talked to about locking the city down. Now he privately talked to Hoffman about feeling abandoned by the COG. He doesn't want to leave his home. To him, that's not really an option. But at least airlift some food. People get restless and desperate. It's only a matter of time until the first forged ID card is going to be discovered. The city's small and everyone knows each other by face, so that may deter people, but for how long? Because as of right now, 700 calories a day is hard to get by. And that's what Hoffman restricted food to. Alderman was right, but also it gave them 3 times as long to hold out. As of now, Anvil Gate has only been on lockdown for about 2 weeks. Their talks becoming more and more concerning as the days go on, would always stop just short of questioning how much food was stashed away for the garrison versus the civilian population. They both knew in the end gears were priority to keep the fight going, but hunger pains don't stop anyone. Not to mention the threat of disease. Anvil Gate's ancient sewer system needed minimal water flow to stay working. Now it was backed up and the whole city smelled of shit. The weather was only getting warmer, making it all the worse. As far as that concern went, they'd come to the conclusion of dumping the human waste outside of the walls, having to create this program of collecting it all into a truck and then at night releasing it at a designated dump site. Meanwhile, the Pasangas have more than carried their own weight. While the civilians were suffering the more aggressive rationing, a justification by gears saying they needed to move and be in shape as civilians didn't need to. The Pasangas were out killing goats in the field, butchering them and hauling the meat alongside any UIR gear they found back into the fort. It almost got to the point where Hoffman had to tell everyone to keep the doors of the mess hall closed. The strong aroma of the food would undoubtedly trigger angry civilians. And truthfully, he did feel bad about it. But it was simply their way of trying to not touch the food stashed away and keep everyone alive as long as possible. As Hoffman was thinking about the positive impact the Pasangas were making and how Baitak had developed into a natural leader, he got some more positive news. Brigade HQ had put together an old helicopter. Slow, but capable of delivering a massive amount of supplies. Hell, even dropping a bulldozer underslung its cargo to move the rubble later is a real possibility. The cargo, from what it sounded like right now though, was everything Anvil Gate needed. It was a mixture of water, medicine, food, and just enough fuel to get by. They'll figure out the logistics when the time comes. Hovering around is just going to ask for trouble, and then dropping it in a ravine meant both the COG and Indies would have to race for it. The chopper was about 2 hours out, so in the meantime, the basics of having Burns set up some security positions while the gunner teams prepared for covering fire was all set into motion. The goal was to keep the Indies' attention just long enough to stop them from paying attention to the helicopter, keep them busy without risking running out of Anvil Gate's own munition stockpile. Of course, all the good did also come with some bad. Byrne came clean on potentially miscounting their food supply. Dry rations are lower than expected. He brought up the same concern Alderman and Hoffman had. their civilian help, potentially raiding their food supplies. A painful thought, as stealing any kind of supplies in a theater of war was a capital offense, meant to be delivered right then and there with no trial. The COG had its moments of brutality as well. For Hoffman, the thought of the Siege of Barefist came to mind. They had to put up armed guards on ambulances to prevent locals from stealing the fuel out of them, while paramedics went to haul off bodies. This brought Hoffman to yet another touchy subject. Privately, he told Sam if they end up evacuating the civilians, he wanted him to leave with Shariah. He's going to need to be there for his new wife and baby. But Sam rejected it, telling Hoffman that was thoughtful and extremely kind, but Shariah wouldn't want to leave her city, and he won't leave any of his gears behind. It's exactly what Hoffman expected Sam to say. He'd figure a way to convince him one way or the other eventually. 2 hours later, when Hoffman was able to finally see his chopper on the horizon, officially known as a Corva, technically long decommissioned, it moved him. He couldn't help but think about poor Captain Sander and how he would have wanted to paint this thing as its silhouette casted so beautifully against the horizon backdrop. He then came into contact with the pilot after explaining the terrain to the north of the forts was nothing but slopes and loose gravel. The chopper thus decided to land, hoping Anvil Gate can indeed keep the UIR busy just long enough to ensure a safe delivery. But the helicopter was so loud the Indies were already onto it, so they began opening fire. The fire between Anvil Gate and the UIR was okay at first, with no direct fire at the helicopter, which did manage to land on a slope that was just level enough for it to handle. Hoffman, watching from the gantry, crouching low on the main wall, as to minimize his own outline in the case of snipers, began to oversee civilians and gears beginning to unload the cargo. Fuel first, just in case a shot hit the chopper, they don't all want to go down in a ball of flames. Truthfully, watching the gears and civilians work to unload the helicopter gave Hoffman mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it'll give him about another month of holding out, but it will be a bitch to get the supplies into the city, requiring gears and civilians to somehow get it over the city walls, one single crate at a time. A long, arduous job. One problem at a time, Hoffman supposed. As the wind around here began to intensify, the Corva's pilot said she had to circle around to readjust so that way it doesn't keep getting caught in this crosswind. While hearing this in his earpiece, Hoffman saw a flash of lights and a smoke streak come from his right-hand side. About a moment later, the Corva's right flank exploded by the impact of a rocket. Despite all the fuel being offloaded, the rocket ended up lighting the entire skyline bright orange as the Corva immediately burst into a ball of flame. The rotors and burning airframe tumbled back down over the slopes, leaving only a trail of black smoke and the sound of secondary explosions as an indicator of where it had gone down. Hoffman's additional month of supplies and the poor gear who risked her life to keep theirs going was now all gone. The only thing they managed to get off was just a little bit of fuel. He knew there was no hope for her either. A fire team couldn't do anything, but he still requested one to be put together and asked everyone to search for any medics that they could manage to spare to head off for the burning wreckage. Despite all of Pasinga's great progress lately, there was still much more work to be done, evidently. 3 months later, General Kenneth Markham Amory, Chief of the General Staff, would write a letter to Colonel James Choi at Brigade HQ in Lakar. It was a depressing letter, to say the least. Choi would forward the gist of it to Hoffman. The basics were, High Command won't risk any more aircraft at Anvil Gate. It's ultimately at a stalemate. The General Staff deemed it necessary to keep the pass closed because that denies the UIR access. The UIR did also offer to let the civilians of Anvil Gate get evacuated, but there was a condition on their evacuation. The garrison of Gears had to retreat and surrender as well. If the garrison commander of Anvil Gate was worried about the fate of the civilians, COG High Command reassured them that they don't think the civilians are going to fare well one way or the other. Hearing this, Hoffman chose to keep the civilian chances to himself, but he did go on to pass this info on to Alderman Kasani. And Kasani's recommendation? Well, he wanted Hoffman to surrender. By this point, roughly 1,000 or so civilians have died of dysentery, starvation, or just outright left, taking their own individual chances, hopping over the walls, and praying that none of the UIR troops spot them. Hunger took priority for most, but there was also the smell that overtook Anvil Gate. It was a ghastly mix of shit from the sewers that was continuously backing up and burning death. Anvil Gate had started to burn both sewage and dead bodies to alleviate the city's suffering, but really it wasn't doing much of anything. Hoffman was considered one of the luckier ones in terms of suffering from starvation, but he still lost roughly 20 kilos of weight. But to him, the entire place had long passed the point of compromise. They'd been here for well over 3 months. There was no reason to surrender. He had promised to keep the city, and despite his best efforts, civilians have died. But Anvil Gates is still holding, and that's what mattered. Surrendering now would do nothing but piss on the graves of those who had already passed away. Orders to hold the forts are still what he was told, and he came to the conclusion that if he was ordered today to hand over the fort, he'd probably be the only one here, left alone. God, he missed Margaret. Lately, he's been on the verge of crying himself to sleep. He wondered if it was his body telling him it was time to just listen to Alderman, or maybe it was his resolve and faith just being tested. Whatever it was, orders were orders. He was determined to see the siege won now. But that was his orders. Alderman could leave if he wanted and take the rest of the civilians with him. Hoffman pointed out to him that he looked exhausted and hit particularly hard with fatigue. If he did leave, though, there was no guarantee without the gears leaving with him that they won't be gunned down by UAR troops waiting for the chance to claim any COG lives. What is there really for them to do? Then there's the situation of the city itself. Motor fire had decimated all internal walls within the city, officially obliterating the thin barriers between civilian and military life that had already coexisted here for seemingly the beginning of time. But now with the physical barriers gone, it became more and more impossible to protect the ration storage from being raided by some civilians. Hunger didn't allow Hoffman to ever think straight on that topic. He knew people were stealing, but seeing packs disappear 2 at a time only made him angry. There was no rational logic behind it. The hunger pains didn't allow him to strategically think straight anymore. The Pasangas would of course go out and offset the shortfall, but even that was only temporary. The raids on the food was affecting Hoffman's gear's ability to fight. His gears in the end is what kept him going. Everyone knew stealing during wartime was met with death, but then again, cash curries have lived on the border of potential war for so long, it was starting to look as if none of them really believed the gear would kill them. A rude awakening is coming when that day of gunning down a food thief in front of everyone else, as an example, arrives. As of now, the gears have already caught one person. Hoffman had kept it a secret for a while, but hitting a breaking point of these people stealing, affecting his gears, he'd finally tell Alderman here and now that his men had found someone with his pantry full of COG rations. The man's name was Gerald Attar. Alderman, caught between what looked like prayer and just trying to stay silent, finally spoke up, saying Attar had 2 children. He's a clerk, not a traitor. A threat? No. He's watching his family starve, Lieutenant. Admittedly, the words triggered Hoffman. He could feel a sense of rage begin to take over. He had to physically use most of his strength to stop himself from yelling at Alderman, explaining why his gears needed every bit of food that was designated to them. They had the right to eat that food set aside for them, just as civilians had certain levels of food set aside for them based off their activity levels. Food stolen from a gear endangered everyone and carried a ripple effect of expanding outward. He could go on, but he stopped, simply telling Alderman Attar admitted to stealing. They arrested him, and he expected Alderman to carry out the sentence of capital punishment. Hoffman wanted to keep the sense of hanging on to things like civility and basic standards of society, such as law and order, alive. Because if he can't do that, then how can they expect to carry on? Really, this part of hanging on to the little things is one of those small details that would be likened to the war with the Locust for Hoffman many years later. Despite appearances and entire sections of the military obliterated, after E-Day, Hoffman always shaved and tried to keep his uniform as presentable as possible. He learned here, during the Siege of Anvil Gates, that appearances had the profound effect on people. To keep going and hang on, no matter. As far as the thief Gerald Attar goes, Hoffman did privately sympathize with him. But laws needed to be upheld. If Alderman doesn't carry out his sentencing, Hoffman will personally do it. His justification was Attar was already starving to death, so it doesn't matter if he was shot by COG authorities or just left. Alderman, sitting with it for a while, would question, what are they living for if they have no compassion? Attar, he can't sentence him to death to save the rest of these people. It's just not within Alderman. These people are his friends. He's known them his entire life. He's asking a lot out of them. Well, Hoffman said, you can take them all and still leave. Hoffman can try to get a message to the Indies, letting them know civilians are leaving, but worded advice to Alderman, head north and spread out as much as you can. Doing so would make it much harder for the UIR to kill so many of them. If they're lucky, most of them will make it, but if they stay here in Anvil Gate, they're living under Cog law. Atar is dead either way. Hoffman grabbed Kasani by his biceps, hauled him to his feet, and pushed him to where Atar was being held. He wasn't being held far, simply in an adjacent room guarded by only Baitak. When Hoffman and Kasani opened the door, they found Atar sitting in a lone, dark room with only a wooden chair. Atar. Poor guy was in his 30s, thin, balding, just a regular guy. When he seen Kasani, he sprung to his feet and immediately apologized. Hoffman interrupted, saying that he knows that he's sorry, and he's sorry for this too. But everyone knows the stakes here. None of this was personal, and there was no sense in dragging all of this out apart from the cruelty of it. So, Hoffman put a pistol in Kasani's hands and coldly told him, "Do it, it's the law." Alderman pushed back one final time, though, desperately questioning why there isn't a hearing. How can anyone blame Atar for what he did? Anyone else would do what he did, especially since he was watching his family starve. Staring blankly at Alderman's attempts to plead on Atar's behalf, Hoffman began to think in more pragmatic terms. He was calm now, but he was beginning to slowly anger himself again based off the logic he was sharing to himself. The way he's seen it in basic terms, without minimum rations, his gears wouldn't be able to fight. They would die one way or the other, but they followed the rules written or unwritten. This man has not. No matter how understandable his desperation for his family was, that doesn't matter. Hell, Sam Byrne wouldn't even bend the rules to let Hoffman get him out. He gave him, his girlfriend, and his unborn kid a chance to get out. He rejected it. That's a gear, a damn man. His life, it counts. In the end, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger as long as the sentence was carried out, so Hoffman took the pistol from Alderman. For a second, his eyes met with Baitak, who didn't look shocked. He stood clear of the door, but understood this was survival now. Hoffman glanced down, cocked the pistol back, trying to work out what the hell the right wording for this charge was, then he held the muzzle straight up to Atar's head. Gerald Atar, you've admitted to an act of injurious theft as defined by the Military Emergency Measures Act. That by stealing rations intended for coalition soldiers, you endangered them and their ability to defend the COG. The penalty is death, and in the name of the chairman of the Coalition of Ordered Governments, I shall now carry that out. Atar said nothing. Hoffman met his eyes for moments, looked away, and pulled the trigger. Kasani was staring at the body, sobbing. If you wanted to tell everyone who did it, that was fine, as long as people around here knew that there was now consequences. As for Hoffman, this all felt odd. Killing someone so close you can see the whites of their eyes wasn't particularly new. He was used to close quarters combat. Executing someone was different. Hoffman wondered the kind of defense, if any, Margaret would have had for Atar. Then he thought of speaking to Patrick. As a sniper, he must have seen that helpless look people give so many times, so up close and vivid through the scope of a rifle. Baitak, almost as if to comfort Hoffman, simply said, "You did good, sir. Tough, but doing right don't always feel good," and he was right. It sucked, but Hoffman would have felt so much worse if he hadn't done it. His conscience would have a field day with him later, one way or the other. No matter, his mind went to the next objective. He'd asked Baitak, what was the Gears' overall supply situation? Fuel? Bai asked. It was just about the only thing that they really had left, that they haven't been consuming consistently. Good. Hoffman ordered to get some fuel together, scrap up a platoon, and all of the city councilmen. Curious order. So, Baitak would ask what Hoffman was planning. Simple. He was planning a surrender. Open the gates up and let the indie bastards inside. Now, of course, Hoffman wasn't actually planning a real surrender. It wouldn't be until the next day the plan was truly unveiled. Putting together all of the Pasengo who recon the UIR force, said there's roughly 200 young UIR troops just outside the city's walls. The most likely ones to enter the fort, that is. Hoffman, Patrick, Sam, Carlisle, and Evan were huddled over a map of the city of Anvil Gate. These five had already established the plan. Now they let the Pasengas in on it. The idea was to get these 200 UIR troops into the city, believing they were accepting a formal surrender. Most of the city was wood, apart from the gun placements and a few structural holdings keeping the entire city up. They have plenty of fuel and dry garbage lying around, so what they're going to do is soak everything in fuel, place as much garbage in key locations as possible in a way that won't arouse suspicion, rig up some flamethrowers, a few concealed gun placements, snipers in some spots as well, and then let them all burn. If they run, snipers and the gun placements will take care of the stragglers. As far as civilians and any gears caught in the fire, well, Patrick would go on to explain. A particular quarter of this section is all wooden, so anything there will immediately be incinerated. However, around the corner from there, everything is made of stone. fire shouldn't catch there. If it does, or if people can't make it to that corner, Patrick pointed out key points in the city where you can gain access to the tunnels. Worst case scenario, if you can't escape the fire, then get into the tunnels and basically wait it out. After a few moments of silence, Hoffman figured he better do it now, asking Sam if he can still get into contact with the UIR officer. Sam goes on to share that he knows a particular channel the UIR use a lot. It's uncrypted, so there's no telling what the response time will be like, but worst case scenario, they can always reach out to Brigade HQ on an open channel and let the UIR eavesdrop. As Hoffman fiddled with the radio, Bytok sat back thinking to himself. Over these last few months, he had come to know Hoffman quite well, and springing an ambush on the Indies may well be the only way to make it out of here, but faking a surrender seemed like a shot to Hoffman's pride. He took honor serious, and stooping so low undoubtedly bugged the hell out of him. After a minute of speaking on the open channel, reporting as the COG garrison at Anvil Gate, a polite voice came on. The man speaking sounded as if he was more of a calm, nice banker rather than the person responsible for shelling Anvil Gates for the last few months. He'd answer as UIR Control from Vasgar, identifying himself as Major Tolly. Hoffman, sounding defeated and exhausted, a move that worked on the Indies but was actually quite true, he'd ask if the offer to evacuate the civilians from Anvil Gate still stood. He was looking for a safe passage for them. Major Tolly confirmed it does, but that does come with the requirement of Hoffman's garrison surrendering too. While staring at the late Captain Sanders' painting of Anvil Gate hanging on the wall on the other side of the room, Hoffman said he understands. But he has his own condition. The civilians have to leave first. Once they're clear, Anvil Gates will open up the gates, and the UIR are allowed to move in. Major Tolly told him he has his word. The civilians are free to leave. Hoffman would relay, "It's a deal then, but he'd keep a close eye on the UIR. If he sees any movements or so much as a cough that he thinks is a rifle round, the deal is off." Wasting no time, he turned to Sam Byrne, instructing him to get a truck together. They can't move all of the civilians, but priorities first. Sam's driving. Hoffman orders him to take his wife, fill the rest of the truck up, and drive east. Byrne stared at Hoffman for a while, then nervously chewed his lip. After a few seconds, he said that he can't do it. He'll put his wife on the truck, she'll drive, but he's not leaving. Hoffman told him that he can give him a crazy bastard speech, but they don't have that kind of time. They need to move fast. This is his last chance. Please go, Sam. Go with your wife and your kid. I want you to. And Patrick jumped in, telling him that they all do. Get going, now. He jokingly even said that they needed someone to tell the story of the heroes of Anvil Gates, but Byrne just shook his head. He told him it wasn't about him. He was a platoon sergeant. That is what he is. It's his duty to stay with his men. He'll catch up with his wife later. Well, that's that then. They all had to move now. Byrne still went on to get the truck together. The rest of them cleared the city street by street, gathering as much fuel as they can, and if a civilian chooses to stay, they were to make sure that they were given a rifle. Most of Anvil Gate civilians chose to stay. As it turned out, many of them were former Gears eager to fight. It only took the Pasangas and a small team of Gears 6 hours to assemble the population and start loading the trucks and carts. Bytok, though, caught Sam cuddling his wife, patting her swollen stomach and telling her that he'd meet her and their child at New Temperance. He helped her clamber up into the driver's seat, holding her hand as long as possible. By wondered if he ever told her that he actually had the chance to go. But then again, maybe things were better off unsaid. The last thing Shariah can be heard saying to her husband was, "Samuel, you better come find us. We'll be waiting." And then the truck pulled away. Sam waited there until the tail lights disappeared, most likely seeing if the Indies broke their promise. After a while of nothing being heard, he felt more comfortable, turned around and told Hoffman, "Let's finish this job." Hoffman couldn't remember just how long they had been besieged for. 80, 100 days. He supposed it didn't really matter, it all felt like a giant blur. He looked like shit because he felt like shit. His tragic last stand backfired and now he was forced to fake a surrender. He likened it to crying rape. Him faking this only meant the next person who really needed to surrender would find it harder to be believed or given acceptable terms. This was extremely big for him because it was the first time during the entire duration of the Pendulum Wars that anyone has ever faked a surrender. He thought it would make its way into the international laws of decency, right next to the law of treating prisoners humanely. Surrenders were sacred, never a ploy. This would make them uncertain from now on. As he stood watching the gates to Anvil Gate open, Lancer slung low, magazine clearly empty with his safety latch on, he found the words to apologize to Byrne for dropping him in the shit. Byrne, smiling, said, "It's alright, sir. You are a bastard, but you're our bastard." Hoffman managed to scrape together a smile back. saying, "I'll remember that, and I'll be sure to use it one day." 2-6 RTI, the Unvanquished. That's us, Sam. When the gates opened, the UIR captain was standing a few meters away. He was a young man who looked quite nice, not like someone who slaughtered refugees or wanted to dominate the world. And that honestly made Hoffman feel a lot much worse about what he was about to do. He needed to hate his enemy. For once, he wanted that clarity. I guess he was going to be rejected at right alongside the shame he'd bring to himself and his unit for doing what he was about to. On the other hand, the UIR captain looked stunned. Most likely never seen a city in the state that Anvil Gate was. Bombed and broken, piled with garbage, uncremated bodies, and human waste was everywhere. It really felt like the city could run out of oxygen at any time. The UIR captain shook off his sense of disbelief, introducing himself as Captain Benislaw of the 15th Furlan Cavalry. He saluted and added, "Lieutenant Hoffman, the Union of Independent Republics thanks you for your honorable decision. I now require your formal surrender," which amounted to Hoffman handing over his lancer with both of his hands. It's not like he had any ammunition for it left anyways. It all felt honorable, extremely weird. But sticking to his plan, Hoffman would ask Captain Benislaw to discuss the treatment of his men and the remaining civilians who chose to stay. Explaining, as the UIR can tell, due to the conditions of the city, they're all huddled up in the old section of the city where the city's authorities' office is located. Benislaw, for a moment, dismissed it, saying his first priority was having his men clear the city, which, as he started to do, you could hear Benislaw mumble, "Oh God," under his breath. Byrne commented on how he spoke remarkable tyrant, but also, yeah, what do you expect when you cut off food and water for 5,000 people? He told Benislaw to watch his step and don't get too close to anyone. Many have dysentery and some kind of respiratory disease. That's, again, why so many of the healthy individuals huddle up in the old section of the city. Technically true. You can imagine much of the reason to push Captain Benislaw, though, was because where the majority of the city's wooden buildings were located, and thus the prime location the trap was meant to be set. But now was the time for Patrick and the Pasengas to monitor the UIR movement. When the bulk of the 15th Furlans were inside, the gates were to close and all main exits set ablaze. No final word from Hoffman was really needed. A scary thought now, thinking he may actually burn to death here, but the tour of Captain Benislaw was more preoccupying to Hoffman. Benislaw admired the gun placements all around the city's walls, machine guns covering every square inch. Useless now since they all ran out of ammunition, but good at showing just how much of a death trap Anvil Gate could be. Then Benislaw admired the massive 2 cannons, followed by retiring to the main office to sit and discuss the surrender terms with Hoffman. As he sat, he was even apologetic to Hoffman, explaining he wasn't thinking, removing his pistol from his side holster and sitting it on the table in full view. And then he gave Hoffman a water bottle. Damn, was this becoming harder and harder by the minute. This man was truly well and better than Hoffman, who can now hear the Pasengas and other gears all whispering in his earpiece, making sure everything was set and ready to go. Crazy that it took this long for 200 UIR troops to move into such a small city. Crazier still was Hoffman worrying more about finding more common ground with these people than he needed to. Turning the attention back to Captain Benislaw, he'd ask if there was any document he needed to sign. He did. As Benislaw began to search for a piece of paper in a briefcase, Hoffman can hear Patrick saying to him that not all of the UIR troops are in, but they are ready to roll. It's up to Hoffman to give the final word. Hoffman closed his eyes, and in the faintest whisper, said, "Yes, do it for Sander." "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Lieutenant," Captain Benislaw said. Then the first explosion blew out the window of the office Benislaw and Hoffman were in. Apparently it was much closer than Carlisle had planned it to be. The ceiling caved in, but it didn't collapse. Hoffman grabbed Captain Benislaw's pistol from the table and crawled under the table for a moment to make sure no more debris from the roof came down on him. The dust in the room was as thick as smoke. Hoffman knew he had to get out of the room ASAP and regroup with a platoon sergeant. Then he heard the gargled words of Captain Benislaw. He was still alive. He was on the ground bleeding profusely from his head, mumbling, "But we were just talking." It sounded as if Hoffman's worst crime was breaking his word. Too late, you gotta commit. Watching Benislaw feel aimlessly around on the floor for his pistol or maybe even his own lieutenant that was right by his side only a few moments ago, Hoffman stood over him and shot him twice in the head. It was pure muscle memory. His internal voice was yelling at him, questioning how he can do this to someone else. How could he disgrace himself and kill someone so polite to him? He had to shut that nagging voice off somehow. Next thing Hoffman knew, though, was he was rushing through the broken door, looking for escape before he started to regret it all even more. Making his way to the street, the fires were taking hold. The Silver Era architecture, carved wooden frames, gargoyles, and plaster made of horsehair, all went up in flames. Evan, far from sight, had managed to give the UIR a taste of what it was like to be on the receiving end of an experienced COG engineer, expertly setting off a long, simultaneous chain of explosions that ran down the street north to south. It ended up cutting the city in half, practically burning a whole block in a single instant. The fuel vapor that had hovered above soaked garbage bags has also successfully started to explode at random moments. Add to that the automatic fire that rang from every direction, and you have your very own slice of personal hell. Since the vapor made it all that much more unpredictable on what was going to explode next, it was paramount that all the gears regroup and center fire in one spot, force the Indies to fight them in the fire. Hoffman ran to a stone staircase, giving him the first elevated look of Anvil Gate burning. Below, he can see 3 gears surrounded by a handful of dead UIR troops. Attempting to organize his men, he reached for his earpiece, and as it turned out, radios luckily were still working. He called for all call signs to retreat to the perimeter, but he wasn't sure if anyone actually heard him. He could hear a stomper going off on the other side of the gantry. Running in that direction, when he turned the corner, he can see Gerald and Byrne manning it together. Gerald was working as Sam's spotter, calling out targets while Byrne rained explosives down on them. Seeing Hoffman, Gerald shouted, "Bytack and the other Pasingas have gone down into the alleys." Hoffman told him that he would go after them, but needed a rifle first. Looking around, he would grab one off of a dead gear, an engineer by the name of Hollis. Another casualty Hoffman would have to mourn later. The problem, though, was another thing that they haven't accounted for. And that was the fires now were getting way too out of hand. They were expanding in such a way no one can take any kind of cover. If you died or fell, there was a chance of being burned to death or just being incinerated, making it all the harder to identify bodies later. The only silver lining out of that issue was, thanks to Evan's careful planning, most UIR troops breaking cover trying to escape the fire will run into the open square, where Gears placed a light machine gun with that exact thought in mind. The Gears manning that gun were just kicking their feet up and picking off anyone who walked by. After running down many winding, long tunnels and tight alleyways, Hoffman made his way to a section of the old city miraculously not touched by the fires yet. From around the corner, he can hear the Pasingas making noise. It was a noise that was quite unique. It was a mixture of pessang and shrieks of sheer animal terror. Eventually, he ran into the Pasingas leaving a small shop. Their lancers slung on their back, machetes drawn. Hoffman, confused, would ask them if they just gave up on chasing the Indies that they were after. Gerald had seen them running after a group of UIR soldiers heading for the storage houses. But then Hoffman looked inside the shop, and seeing there was a machine gun aimed out the front window. At the base of that gun, 5 dead Indies were sprawled all around it. Their bodies had signs of being hacked to death by machetes. Before Hoffman can turn around to face the Pasingas, he can hear Bytack say, "No room to fire in there, so we do close quarters our way." By now, if the big hand on Hoffman's watch was correct, it's been about an hour since the first explosion. It was nigh on impossible to get a hold of anyone on the radio now, so Hoffman had to do his best, going street to street to see who was still standing. The gunfire was less steady and more intermittent by now. Gradually, he would find more of the gunners and a few gears from his own platoon. Some of them would stop to share whatever information they had with Hoffman, while others were just a blur of armor as they ran past clearing Indies or looking for a new position to set up. Making mental notes of everyone he's seen, the one person he never caught was Sam. So Hoffman decided to head back to the gun placement where he last seen Byrne. Finally getting a sight on Byrne, fearful of alerting any Indies, Hoffman began to whisper to get Sam's attention. Sam, come on man, we gotta get going." As Hoffman approached, he noticed Byrne hadn't left his position. He was also in a half-sitting, half-squatting posture, on top of a shallow ammo crate with one arm draped over the stomper and his forehead resting on its optics. Seeing that caused Hoffman's stomach to knot up. He knew what he was looking at, but he didn't want to believe it. Maybe Byrne had just paused for a minute to rest, exhausted from the continuous stomper fire. But he didn't move when Hoffman got right next to him. "Shit, Sam." He went to check his throat for a pulse, but as he stretched his arm out, he noticed a large exit wound in the center of Sam's back. Leaning back, Hoffman whispered, "Shit, I'm sorry. God damn it, I'm sorry." He immediately began to beat himself up. From his perspective, if he had gotten his shit together sooner, Sam may still be alive. And what does that mean by getting his shit together? Well, he was making mental notes of every dead civilian and gear he passed by, trying to keep a mental notes of their bodies so he can easily come back to retrieve them later. He should have been more focused on the living than the dead. Defeated, he made his way back to the main gun placement. Patrick was there with 5 of the Pasingas. Carlisle was there too. He made it, but he had severe burns on his hands. Seeing Hoffman, Patrick lit up, saying, "We did it, sir. I got a call into Brigade HQ. They know we held it. Still the fucking unvanquished." Now there was still the occasional burst of automatic fire in the background, but Hoffman in a quiet tone simply said, "So we are." His legs couldn't support him any longer. He went to go back to the room where he and Benislaw were before all this went down. He wanted to find a chair to sit in, but those were all gone, so he just slapped himself up against the wall and slid down until the weight of his armor brought his whole body slamming to the ground. He shut his eyes, trying to get the taste of smoke out of his mouth, but it didn't matter how much he spat, it was just stuck in there. Then he started to think. They won, but at what cost? The bastards haven't taken Anvil Gate. He's sure Shariah Byrne would take comfort in that. As he was lost in thought, dwelling on failing his friend, Bytack popped up seemingly out of nowhere. He tried to shake Hoffman awake, desperately asking if he had a radio on him. He did, but he couldn't be bothered. So Bytack took the radio off of his hip and held it to Hoffman's ear. It was a cheery woman on the other end, a helicopter pilot flying one of the new Ravens. She identified herself as RR-17, asking to hear back from Anvil Gates. Hoffman couldn't muster any words. So Bytack took the radio, saying, "Anvil Gates RR-17, this rifleman talk. Lieutenant Hoffman, he injured, but says, 'Where the fuck you been, lady?'" The Raven pilot, still cheery, said, "There's a lot of COD traffic headed your way from both sides. ETA 1 hour, but stand by for case evac in 10 minutes. You would think that would have made Hoffman happy, but it didn't. There was no joy. There was no giving Bytack any form of manly hugs or celebration, or even coming out with a funny one-liner to draw from inspiration in the movies that he was taught to do in a charming or uplifting way. That wasn't real life. Real life was disappointing, and it just left him angry. He couldn't even frame that anger in a stream of cussing. The near unbearable thing at the top of his head was that 2 kids would now never know their dads, and Hoffman had a chance to protect them both. He couldn't imagine anything worse than 2 kids growing up without their father, and that ate at him. Still, beating himself up, Bytack reached above him and took something off the wall. He then rolled it carefully like a scroll and put it in the empty holster on Hoffman's webbing. It was one of Sanders' many small watercolors of Anvil. One of the ones in particular that Hoffman always made fun of him for, thinking he was so stupid that this place was magical, that he loved how the bright colors and vivid horizon with the backdrop of the Silver Era architecture was so beautiful. Funny how things you can make fun of and jab at and consider so trivial was now so substantial. Before walking away, Bytack would tell him, "There, sir, for your Mrs. Hoffman, so she know what you did at Anvil Gate."